What if a single event changed the course of history forever? When a powerful empire suddenly fails in a place it thought insignificant? And what if a man trained by this empire became its most dangerous opponent? This is exactly what we are talking about today, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, one of the most famous and momentous conflicts of antiquity. A battle full of betrayal, tactics, power, and the question of how vulnerable even the largest empire in the world really was. But before we start, I'm interested in your opinion. Was the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest really the decisive turning point for Rome in Germania? Or is its importance perhaps overestimated today? Write your answer now in the comments. And if you're fascinated by history, big battles, and exciting backgrounds, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more videos. And now we go back to a time when dense forest, mud, and deception decided the fate of legions. Chapter 1, Prologue, the Empire and the Wild North. At the beginning of the 1st century AD, it seemed that there was no power in the world that could seriously resist the Roman Empire. Rome was more than just a city. Rome was a thought, a claim, a promise of order, law, and unshakable strength. From the dusty roads of Hispania to the scorching provinces of Syria, from the coasts of North Africa to the fertile plains of Gaul, there was a network of roads, garrisons, administration, and commerce that connected the familiar parts of the world. Where Roman eagles stood, Roman law applied. Where Roman legions marched, chaos gave way to discipline. At least that's what they believed in Rome. At the heart of this mighty empire sat Augustus, the first emperor, the man who had brought peace after years of bloody civil wars. Not the peace of weakness, not the peace of renunciation, but the peace of the victor. The Pax Romana, as it would later be called, was not a silent agreement among peoples, but an order based on power. It was sealed with treaties, organized with taxes, and where necessary, defended with iron and blood. Rome saw itself not only as a ruler of countries. Rome saw itself as the center of civilization. For many of its citizens, this idea had become a matter of course. In the forums, senators discussed laws and provinces, merchants calculated profits from distant trade routes, officials counted taxes, priests interpreted signs of the gods, and veterans told their sons about campaigns in countries whose names sounded foreign in Rome, but whose riches had long since increased the splendor of the capital. The empire had become great because it had learned to either break or take advantage of all resistance. Defeated peoples could remain enemies, or become subjects, taxpayers, allies, recruits. Rome was patient. Rome was brutal. And Rome was convinced that everything that eluded its order would sooner or later be absorbed into it. This principle had already proven itself in the West. Gaul, once a land of countless tribes, proud warriors, and unpredictable princes, had become a Roman province after Caesar's campaigns. The scars of the conquest had been deep, but Rome had built roads, founded cities, built garrisons, and tied local elites to itself. Former opponents became administrators, traders, and officers. Where Druids once watched over sacred groves, Roman officials now watched over warehouses and custom stations. For Rome, this was proof that even the wildest lands could be tamed. But on the other side of the Rhine, another world began. There, where the broad river flowed like a boundary between two orders, lay a country that only inaccurately took shape in the maps of Rome. Germania. A space of forests, swamps, rivers, hills, and mists. No unified kingdom, no orderly state, no large cities with walls, forums, and temples. Instead, scattered settlements, fortified farmsteads, clearings in the forest, and a web of tribes, clans, alliances, and enmities that was difficult to see through even for those who were born there. The Romans looked at this land with a mixture of contempt and fascination. It seemed to be poor in the wealth that Rome knew how to exploit so well. No glittering metropolises, no rich port cities, no well-known kingdoms with which treaties could be concluded. And yet Germania was not insignificant for Rome. It was the restlessness that emanated from there. Again and again, Germanic groups had threatened the borders, invaded Gallic territories, or interfered in the power games west of the Rhine. Rome could not simply leave such a border to itself. Where order ended, danger began. In the minds of Roman strategists, the Rhine was therefore not just a river. It was a provisional line. A border that had to be secured, monitored, and if it seemed opportune, also crossed. For an empire like Rome rarely thought in terms of permanent limitations. It thought in zones of influence, in buffer areas, in the extension of security through submission. The Germanic tribes were difficult for the Romans to classify. She was described as tall, strong, combative, and impetuous. Men with light hair, rough voices, and a tendency to sudden violence. She was considered brave but unrestrained, for freedom-loving but uncultured, dangerous, but politically incapable of reaching a lasting agreement. This assessment was reassuring for Rome. A fragmented country without a unified leadership was easier to influence. You could give gifts to individual tribal leaders, play others off against each other, take hostages, make and break alliances, recruit auxiliary troops, and use conflicts to expand your own presence step by step. But what seemed like political wisdom was often based on overconfidence. For the Romans often saw in Germania only what fit into their own worldview. They saw no cities and thought the country was backward. They did not see a common crown and considered its inhabitants to be permanently divided. They saw no stone temples and considered the bond of people to their gods to be less strong. But the order of Germania followed other rules. It was not weaker, only harder to read. What Rome considered primitive impermanence was in fact a society based on personal loyalty, honor, descent, and close proximity to the community. Decisions were not made in marble-cooled halls, but in the circle of warriors, clan leaders, and tribal elders. Power was not far away, abstract and administrative. It was visible, tangible, and always linked to the ability to gain and maintain allegiance. The war also had a different face there. The Roman legions were machines of discipline. Every man had his place, every unit its order, every march its order. The strength of the legion lay not only in the courage of the individual, but in the precision of the whole. Shield to shield, row after row, practiced in camp construction, formation changes, and coordinated force, Roman soldiers could fight even under the most adverse circumstances, as long as their order was maintained. The Germanic warriors, on the other hand, fought differently. They knew their country down to the most hidden corners. They moved quickly, relied on surprise, on immediate force, on the moment. Their strength lay not in uniform discipline, but in wildness, knowledge of the terrain, and determination. For open field combat under ideal conditions, Roman legions might have been superior. But Germania was not a country of ideal conditions. The forest itself seemed to be a power there. For a Roman, forest was often something that had to be cleared, measured, or crossed. For many Germanic tribes, however, it was a habitat, shelter, and holy place at the same time. There were differences, rivalries, and changing alliances between the tribes, but many shared this close bond with the country. Forests and moors were not just landscapes. They were allies. They swallowed paths, separated men from each other, made marching orders more difficult, and turned even small distances into grueling obstacles. An army accustomed to wide roads, clearly recognizable fronts, and predictable supplies quickly lost some of its strength there. Germania was not a country that could be conquered with maps alone. You had to be able to read it, its soil, its weather, its silence. And this silence was deceptive. While many in Rome believed that the North would sooner or later integrate into the empire, deep resistance was brewing on the other side of the Rhine. He was not always open. It was often hidden under gestures of cooperation, trade relations, the reception of Roman envoys, or the willingness of individual princes to come to terms with Rome. Some saw advantages in the proximity to Rome, protection against rival tribes, access to prestige, weapons, influence. Sons of noble families were sometimes brought up according to the Roman model or even served in the army. Alliances of this kind were no exception. They were part of the Roman strategy. Those who could educate future opponents to be allies had to draw fewer swords. But this was precisely a danger that Rome underestimated. Anyone who knows two worlds also knows their weaknesses. In the coming years, this border region would not be an ordinary conflict. Not just another insurrection, not just a failed campaign, not just a clash between legions and local warriors. Rather, in the shadow of Roman certainty, a catastrophe would be prepared that would shake the self-image of the empire. Hardly anyone in Rome had any idea that one of the most bitter defeats in Roman history was imminent precisely where they believed they would bring order. But at this point in the story, there was little sign of that. On the maps of the generals, Germania was a space that could be developed. In the reports of the governors, it was a restless but controllable region. In the minds of many senators, it was a country that, once administration and law were firmly established, would take the same path as other conquered territories before. It was only a matter of time, it was thought, before taxes would be collected there, camps would be turned into cities, and tribal leaders would be made clients of Rome. It was underestimated that conquest is not the same as domination. A legion can traverse an area, burn down villages, take hostages, and raise banners. But to truly rule a country is to understand its rhythm, to see through its people, and to recognize resistance before it takes shape. This is precisely where Rome was to fail. Not a lack of strength, but a lack of understanding. In the belief that all people should ultimately be governed by the same rules. In the arrogance of an empire that considered its order to be universal. On the other side of the Rhine, people observed Rome with different eyes. For some, it was a distant miracle, streets of stone, shining armor, orderly columns, coins with the image of the emperor, cities full of goods and temples. For others, it was a cold alien power that took what it wanted and made its demands with iron matter-of-factness. Admiration and hatred were close together. Some Germanic princes realized that Rome could not simply be confronted head-on. Others did not want to bow down, no matter how big the price might be. Between adaptation and resistance, between alliance and betrayal, between reverence and contempt, a field of tension grew that was just waiting for a spark. This spark would not be lit in Rome. Not in the Senate, not in the court of Augustus, not in the archives of the administrators or the tents of the commanders. He would be born on the border, where two worlds touched and misunderstood each other. There where men wore Roman armor and still thought Germanic. There where friendship and mistrust could not be separated. There where the forest was quiet enough to keep a secret for a long time. So this story does not begin with the noise of the battle, but with the silence before it. With an empire at the height of its power and a country that has not yet had a place in history in the eyes of this empire. With generals who believed they were bringing order. With tribes that knew that freedom can sometimes only be defended in secret. With paths that lead into dark forests, and with decisions that have been made long before the first sword is drawn. Rome looked north and saw an untamed border. Germania looked to the south and saw an enemy who believed himself invincible. Between the two lay the Rhine, broad, cold, and deceptively calm, as if he already suspected that it would not forever remain the line between hope and destruction. Chapter 2: The Son of Two Worlds. Before Arminius could become an enemy of Rome, Rome had to make him what he was. Therein lay the real tragedy of his story, but also its special force. For Arminius was not an outsider who rushed out of the depths of an unknown forest to oppose an overpowering empire. He was not a nameless tribal warrior, not a random rebel, not a mere leader of an insurgency driven by hatred and instinct. Arminius was a man whom Rome knew. Maybe not in his whole being, maybe not in his innermost core, but enough to trust him. And it was precisely this trust that was later to lead Rome to ruin. He was born into a world that was already in the shadow of the Roman Empire. Not as part of it, not in peaceful subordination, but close enough to be shaped by its power. His father Segimur was a prince of the Cherusci, a Germanic tribe who lived in the regions between the Weser and the Rhine and whose position in the complicated power relations of the border areas was neither insignificant nor unassailable. In a time of growing Roman presence, princes like Segimur had to learn to navigate between proximity and distance. Too open resistance was dangerous. Too much submission, however, risked one's own position in the tribe. Anyone who wanted to survive in this borderline world had to be able to calculate, wait, negotiate, maybe even sacrifice. Rome did not only secure its rule through legions. It also secured them through bonds. Through contracts, honors, gifts, military ranks, and hostages. It was an old principle of imperial policy. If you tied the sons of powerful families to yourself, you often tied the fathers as well. Such young men were not always treated like prisoners. On the contrary, they were able to participate in the education, language, rank, and culture of the empire. This is precisely what made this strategy so effective. Rome did not simply take people into custody. It shaped her. It taught them to see the world through Roman eyes. Potential opponents became mediators, helpers, officers. Men who stood between worlds and were therefore particularly valuable to Rome. Arminius also went this way. At a young age, he was detached from his Germanic homeland and led into the Roman sphere of influence. For a boy of his origins, this meant more than a change of location. It meant a second birth. The world into which he now entered differed in everything from the one from which he came. Where in Germania the power of a man depended on his clan, his bravery, and his personal allegiance, he now entered into a system based on rank, title, law, and discipline. Latin was spoken here. Here it was not the oral tradition of the elders that was decisive, but the written order. Here young men were formed not only into warriors, but into instruments of a state that was larger than any family, any tribe, any single life. For many Germanic nobles, this world was both strange and fascinating. Rome could intimidate, but it could also seduce. In his cities, an order was evident that, from a Germanic point of view, must have seemed almost superhuman. Roads in particular ran over long distances, as if a will had been imposed on the country itself. Walls, bridges, thermal baths, temples, and administrative buildings showed that a people ruled here who could not only fight, but also shape it permanently. The Romans did not simply appear as conquerors. They appeared as bearers of a way of life that claimed to be superior to any other. Arminius got to know this world from the inside. He learned their language, their gestures, their rules. He observed how Roman officers thought, how they gave orders, how they created order, and how they represented power. He saw the art of self-expression, the sober efficiency of military processes, and that calm, self-evident superiority with which Romans spoke about other peoples. He probably understood early on that Rome did not draw its strength from weapons alone. The legions were only the visible expression of a deeper force, the ability to integrate people into structures, to assign them roles, and to form a functioning hierarchy from the most diverse worlds of origin. Arminius also became part of this hierarchy. He served in the Roman army and rose through the ranks. He was given the rank of officer, knighted, or at least awarded that form of recognition that raised him far above the position of a simple auxiliary troop leader. That was no small thing. Rome did not confer military honors lightly, especially not to men from the border regions, whose loyalty was always observed. If Arminius received this recognition, it was because he proved himself. He had talent, courage, and brains. Perhaps also the self-control that Romans valued in officers. Not just bravado, but the ability to grasp situational awareness, lead people, and keep a clear view under pressure. He must not, therefore, be thought of as a rude savage, who happened to be smarter than others in Roman uniform. Rather, Arminius was so dangerous precisely because he had actually understood the Roman world. He knew what discipline meant. He knew marching orders, supply lines, command structures. He saw how legions thought in open battles, how they judged terrain, what they needed to be strong, and what happened when these prerequisites were missing. While many of his compatriots knew Rome from stories or from encounters at the border, Arminius experienced the empire as a system. This experience made him unique. But the deeper a person dives into a foreign world, the greater the question of who he himself still is. Because Arminius was not a Roman. He could speak the Roman language, carry Roman weapons, receive Roman honors. But Origen did not disappear as a result. The memory of the world of his childhood continued to live in him. Of the forests, of the free assemblies, of the faces and voices of his clan, of that immediate way of life that was held together not by administration and stone, but by personal ties. Perhaps he had learned to see some things about it with distance. Perhaps he had even adopted Roman contempt for the disordered and fragmented. But it can hardly be assumed that the years under the Romans have erased his ancestry. Rather, they must have exacerbated the conflict. For Arminius now not only recognized what made Rome strong, he probably also recognized how Rome looked at the Germanic tribes. For many Romans, even loyal men from the border tribes ultimately remained a means to an end. Useful, brave, maybe even respectable, but not really right away. Those who did not come from Rome or the Roman world always moved in an order whose center was elsewhere. Recognition was possible, promotion was possible, honor was possible. But all this happened under conditions set by Rome. Perhaps Arminius learned early on that proximity to Rome never meant complete equality. That you could use him without ever considering him completely as one of your own. It was precisely this experience that could have matured something in him that later became political determination. Because if you know both sides, you are not automatically torn to the point of being unable to act. Sometimes it is precisely through this double perspective that a person becomes clearer. Arminius knew how the Germanic tribes lived. But he now also knew how Rome saw her, how Rome proceeded, and what future Rome had in store for her. It was a future of pacification, administration, taxes, military control, and slow integration into the Reich. For some, this may be progress. For others, submission. For Arminius, this may have been the decisive question. Could a people like his exist in this order without losing itself? Perhaps this question has not yet been asked. Arminius was still part of the Roman system. He still fought on the Roman side, commanded men in the service of the empire, and moved between military function and political importance with the naturalness of an officer. But it is precisely in such years of apparent equilibrium that the deepest shifts often arise. Not suddenly, not at the moment of a single revelation, but slowly, layer by layer. Maybe it was the way Romans talked about Germania. How they reduced entire tribes to administrative problems. How they first saw in each region the ability to control, the satisfaction, the strategic benefit. Perhaps it was the arrogance of some commanders who believed that they had already mastered a landscape once their horsemen had crossed it. Perhaps it was concrete experiences, orders, punishments, humiliations, arbitrary decisions, that showed him what Roman order meant to those who were subjected to it. Perhaps it was also the return to the homeland, the reunion with people whose lives were under growing Roman pressure, that removed the last illusions. Because at some point Arminius returned to Germania. Not as a homeless person, not as a prodigal son, but as a man of rank. He came with Roman experience, Roman prestige, and a knowledge that made him stand out among his compatriots. For the Romans, this was precisely its value. A man like him could mediate, translate, appease. He was able to influence tribal leaders, assess local moods, and give the impression that Germanic interests could be combined with Roman rule. In the eyes of Roman administrators, he was probably the ideal frontier elite, educated, proven, recognized, indigenous enough to be trusted, and Roman enough to be useful. But in truth, Rome had sent back to the border a man who could read both worlds against each other. This did not immediately make him a conspirator. At first, it made him something much more dangerous, an observer. He could see where the Romans were mistaken. He could see what gestures Germanic princes made just for expediency, where insults simmered under the surface, what tribal rivalries could be exploited, and what common fears were strong enough to make alliances possible. He knew how slowly Rome perceived danger when it did not appear in his categories. And at the same time he understood how difficult it was for the fragmented tribes to rise up against a power that was militarily superior and politically skilled. Precisely for this reason, a possible resistance had to be of a different kind. Not openly. Not according to Roman logic. not as a frontal confrontation in which the legions could unleash their full strength. If there is ever a way to defeat Rome in Germania, it will not be by brute bravery alone, but by planning, deception, timing, and a deep understanding of the weaknesses of the opponent. Who could have understood this better than a man whom Rome herself had introduced to the art of warfare? And yet there was a permanent tension in Arminius' position, which also makes him a fascinating figure on a human level. Because he didn't just move from one identity to another. He carried both within him. The Roman heritage did not disappear when he inwardly opposed Rome. And his Germanic origins had never completely left him, even when he was in Roman service. It is precisely this duality that gives his story its depth. He was not a pure hero of national legends, not an immaculate liberator who knew exactly what his destiny was from the beginning. He was a man marked by contrasts, shaped by an empire that at the same time exalted and despised him, and bound to a homeland whose freedom could only be saved at the price of betraying his previous role. Perhaps Arminius understood earlier than anyone else that the real battle was not only between Romans and Germanic tribes, but also between two ideas of order. Rome believed in the power of structure, institution, discipline, permanent integration into a superior rule. Germania lived from personal ties, local roots, pride, honor, and a concept of freedom that eluded state subordination. Arminius knew both logics. That was his strength. But therein also lay its inner price. For he who understands two orders never again belongs entirely to one. So he stood at an invisible transition. To the outside world, he was still the Roman ally, the recognized leader, the man to whom tasks could be assigned. In the eyes of many compatriots, he was perhaps the one who had lived too long among Romans. Perhaps some saw him as a border crosser, others as an upstart, and still others as a beacon of hope. The only thing that is certain is that he had begun to play a role that was greater than his origin and more dangerous than his rank. The son of a prince had become a hinge between two worlds. And each hinge can open a door, or slam it shut. This door was still open. Arminius still spoke with Romans and Germanic tribes. He had not yet come out openly against the Reich. Every look, every word, every gesture could still be interpreted in both directions. But beneath the surface, something was already growing that could no longer be turned back. A will to turn Roman certainty against itself. Not with the strength of a single tribe, but with the knowledge of a man who had understood deep down that empires are often most vulnerable where they feel safest. So this chapter ends with a man who has not yet taken off a mask, but is already wearing several. A man with a Roman education and Germanic blood. An officer of the Reich, and at the same time the son of a country that did not want to submit. One who was an example of successful integration in the eyes of Rome, and in truth had already begun to forge a weapon out of this very integration. Arminius was not a man between worlds because he couldn't decide. He was a man between the worlds, because that was precisely where his power lay. Chapter 3. Publius Quinctilius Varus. If Arminius was the man in whom two worlds met, then Publius Quinctilius Varus was the man who firmly believed that only one of them could last. He was not an adventurer, not a brilliant general of the bold kind who advance into unknown lands with a few troops and force brilliant victories out of chaos. Varus was something else, and perhaps that was precisely the tragedy of his role. He was a man of the system. An administrator, a governor, a representative of that Roman power that was based less on spontaneous heroic deeds than on organization, routine, and unshakable trust in its own order. In peaceful or already pacified provinces, a man like him was of great value. But Germania was not a pacified province. And Varus was to understand that too late. He came from a respectable Roman family, was at home in the political and social world of the upper class, and had pursued a career typical of a man of his rank. In Rome, people rose not only through talent, but also through origin, relationships, experience, and skillful navigation within an intricate web of power, loyalty, and public prestige. Varus had asserted himself in this world. He was not an outsider, not an upstart, but a man who knew how Rome functioned and how to bear responsibility in this empire. It was precisely this that made him suitable for high office in the eyes of the leadership. He had already served in other parts of the empire, where he had gained the kind of experience that was highly valued in Rome. He was familiar with administration, jurisdiction, taxation, and military security. Above all, however, he had experienced provinces in which Roman rule was no longer fundamentally in question. In such areas, it was less a matter of destroying enemies in open battle than of maintaining Roman order. A governor had to secure taxes, involve local elites, ensure peace, and give the impression that Rome not only ruled, but would rule permanently. The empire loved men who created stability, and Varus was one of them. If you want to imagine him, you shouldn't first think of the dusty hero on the battlefield, who himself leads the front line with his sword drawn. One should rather think of a dignified, self-confident Roman whose authority arises from rank, experience, and the dignity of his office. A man who believes that orders are followed because he is the rightful representative of Rome. A man for whom power is not improvised, but comes from structures. This attitude was not merely personal vanity. It was profoundly Roman. In the eyes of a man like Varus, Rome was not simply one state among others. It was the natural form of political order. Those who opposed him were not only against an army, but against civilization itself. This was the strength, but also the blindness, of his thinking. For such a man enters a country like Germania with certain expectations. He does not see a world that must be fully understood according to its own rules, but a territory that is on the way to becoming Roman. Maybe still restless, maybe still raw, maybe still full of local tensions, but basically controllable. In this view, resistance does not appear as an expression of a free political will, but as a temporary disorder, as a remnant of an integration that has not yet been completed. Anyone who thinks this way tends to misinterpret warning signs. Not because he is stupid, but because his categories prevent him from seeing reality as it is. When Varus came to Germania, the Roman presence there had already been expanded. Military operations had given the impression that the country was largely under control. Several tribes had come to terms, or at least not openly resisted. Roman camps, road connections, and alliance systems conveyed the image of a region that had not yet been completely transformed, but was still on the right track. For a man like Varus, this was decisive. He did not confront Germania as a conqueror in the true sense of the word, but as the governor of an area that was increasingly seen as manageable. This is exactly where his fatal error began. Because with this view, the way he acted also changed. Where a general might have remained more cautious, where a man with a finer sense of unstable border areas would have repeatedly re-examined the military situation, Varus apparently began to enforce Roman rule in its civilian form. He made claims, pronounced justice, demanded order, expected obedience. This was not an expression of personal malice, but the logical consequence of his position. A Roman governor who considered an area to be pacified had to treat it accordingly. It was precisely in this that the power of Rome was shown, not only to appear with soldiers, but to turn occupied areas into provinces. But it was precisely this transition that was extremely dangerous in Germania. For what was considered normal in Rome or in already firmly integrated provinces could be perceived as humiliation on the other side of the Rhine. From the Roman point of view, taxes were not a scandal, but an expression of legitimate rule. Justice by Roman officials appeared to be a step forward in the face of local feuds and inconsistent traditions. In Roman eyes, administration meant predictability. For many Germanic tribal leaders and free men, however, all this stood for foreign rule. Not only because it entailed burdens, but because it undermined existing forms of honor, authority, and self-determination. He who pronounces justice rules. Anyone who demands taxes claims superiority. Those who set foreign rules declare the old ones to be secondary. Varus probably did not understand this difference in depth. Perhaps he noticed displeasure. Perhaps he heard complaints, warnings, tensions. But he probably interpreted them within his own order. In his view, dissatisfaction did not necessarily mean an imminent uprising. It could be the usual grumbling of a population that had to get used to new conditions. That's what an administrator thinks. Not necessarily wrong in quiet regions, but deadly in a country that had never really accepted its subjugation. In addition, Varus relied on the mechanisms that had made Rome successful for generations. The Reich worked not only with open violence, but also with cooperation. Local elites played a decisive role in this. Those who had influence could promote stability or curb unrest. Men like Arminius were therefore particularly valuable for a governor. They seemed to be proof that Rome could also win allies in Germania that connected the two worlds. The fact that a Germanic prince's son had enjoyed Roman training was militarily proven and found recognition in the governor's entourage must have seemed almost ideal from Varus' point of view. Here was not just a tribal leader, but a mediator, one who could translate Germania into the order of Rome. And Varus evidently believed in such men. This is one of the central points of his story. He was not simply naive in the childish sense. He acted in accordance with the experiences of an empire that had repeatedly been successful through integration, patronage, and loyalty networks. It was normal for local princes to seek their advantages. It was desirable that they cooperated with Rome. It was well known that not every loyalty was absolute. But Rome was used to mastering these uncertainties. It believed that it could bind people to itself through rank, honor, utility, and superiority. Why should it be any different in Germania? This is precisely why Varus almost inevitably had to underestimate how deep the resistance reached. He probably saw individual tribes, individual interests, individual complaints. What he did not see was the possibility that a man he trusted of all people would begin to bundle these fragmented forces towards a common goal. For a Roman governor, danger was most easily recognizable when it was overt, in the form of armed concentrations, refused surrenders, fortified opponents, or outright hostility. But a danger hidden behind cooperation, which spoke with Roman courtesy and at the same time prepared the ground for disaster, was more difficult to grasp. Varus was also influenced by the Roman conviction that authority also asserts itself through appearance. A governor was not allowed to openly show uncertainty. Hesitation could signal weakness. Toughness and self-confidence, on the other hand, were part of the rule. Anyone who treated an area as pacified reinforced the impression that it was pacified. Perhaps this also played a role in his appearance in Germania. Instead of constantly considering the possibility of a comprehensive uprising, he behaved like a man who was convinced that Rome had long since gained the upper hand. This attitude could be intimidating for submissives, but it could also strengthen those who began to believe that Rome had become blind. In tradition, Varus often appears as a symbol of pride or incompetence. But such an image is too simple. The truth is probably more sobering and therefore more interesting. Varus was not a caricature-like fool. He was a capable representative of imperial rule, but one whose abilities were tailored to a kind of space that Germania was not. In Syria or in orderly provinces, its mixture of authority, administrative practice, and legal rigor may be appropriate. In a borderland full of shifting loyalties, deep cultural alienation, and underlying hostility, the same attitude became a weakness. So he was not so much a bad Roman as a too typical Roman for the wrong place. The longer you look at him, the clearer it becomes that his tragedy is not only personal. In him, the self-image of an empire at the height of its power was condensed. Rome had won so many times, adapted so many times, integrated so many times, that it began to consider its own procedures universal. It believed that any region could be transformed into a province with enough time, pressure, and organization. Varus was the man who embodied this trust. When he pronounced justice, Rome spoke. When he demanded taxes, Rome demanded. If he assumed that loyalty could be managed, then that was not just his personal opinion, but an expression of a basic imperial feeling. Perhaps this also explains why warnings could bounce off him. In a world in which Rome was accustomed to being right in the end, admonishing voices easily sounded like exaggeration, like local panic, or like the attempt of individual actors to secure their own advantages. Who should be better able to judge what was possible in a region than the governor appointed by Rome himself? His office gave authority to his point of view. And authority often creates a dangerous circle. The higher a man stands, the less often he is openly contradicted, and the more likely he is to interpret confirmation as proof of his correctness. At the same time, the human factor should not be underestimated. Varus must have seen more in men like Arminius than mere tools. Trust rarely arises from political calculation alone. Those who work together over a longer period of time, who pursue common interests, exchange information and are dependent on each other, usually develop a minimum of personal confidence. Perhaps Varus considered Arminius ambitious, perhaps proud, perhaps one of those border elites who knew how to use their advantage skillfully. But it is hard to imagine that he saw him as the architect of an existential threat. This is precisely the bitter core of his defeat. He trusted the wrong man not out of sheer stupidity, but because this man appeared exactly as Rome imagined successful integration. Thus, an apparent normality grew around Varus. The machinery of rule was running, orders were given, contacts were cultivated, paths were planned, decisions were made. From the outside, it might seem as if everything was running along the lines of imperial routine. But beneath this surface, the force field has long since shifted. What looked like administration to Varus was already occupation to others. What meant cooperation for him was camouflage for others. What he understood as pacification was in truth only the calm before the blow. And perhaps it was precisely his dignity, his official calm, his conviction of the legitimacy of his own actions that prevented him from recognizing the full extent of the danger until the end. After all, anyone who has learned all their lives that order prevails finds it difficult to believe that order itself can become a trap. Those who are used to thinking in terms of laws, duties, and chains of command easily underestimate the power of the unpredictable, especially when this unpredictability comes from a space that has never really been taken seriously as equal. Thus, Varus stood in Germania not only as a human being, but as a symbol. Rome itself marched in it. His attitude, his decisions, his confidence, his severity, all this was an expression of an empire that took its strength so naturally that it could hardly imagine vulnerability. For Rome, the forest was a space that could be crossed. The tribes were groups that could be managed. Loyalty was something that could be secured. And a governor was the man who translated these certainties into practical action. But it is precisely in such moments that history is at its cruelest. It waits until a power is too sure of itself. It allows routines to develop, trust to grow, hierarchies to consolidate. And then a single crack is enough to shake everything. Varus did not notice this crack because he did not look where it originated. He sought danger in open resistance, not in friendly advice. He expected unrest on the fringes, not in the center of his trust. He thought he was leading a region towards order, when in reality the order he embodied was being led step by step into the abyss. This makes Varus one of the most tragic figures in this story. Not because he is free of guilt. His arrogance, his misjudgment of the country, his trust in inappropriate instruments of rule and his blindness to the signs of the times contributed directly to the catastrophe. But precisely because he was neither a monster nor a fool, his case is all the more haunting. He was a man who represented the empire with seriousness, and precisely for this reason he could not see that this empire encountered borders in Germania that could not be overcome by administrative logic. If Arminius carried the knowledge of both worlds, then Varus carried the weight of only one. He was Rome personified, orderly, self-confident, experienced, legalistic, convinced of his own mission. But where Arminius had learned to think between systems, Varus remained trapped in the one that had made him great. That was his greatness. And therein lay his downfall. He was still standing upright. His office was still unshakable. He still believed that he had the country in front of him, not against him. Little did he know yet that the ways in which he gave orders would soon lead him into a space where rank, law, and dignity would no longer be enough to stop fate. Because a governor can administer a country. But not every country can be administered before it is really conquered. Chapter 4. Peace under Coercion. There is a form of peace that is not based on consent, but on exhaustion, fear, and calculation. A peace in which the guns fall silent, although the will to resist is not broken. A peace that seems orderly from the outside, but is permeated internally by resentment, shame, and suppressed anger. It was precisely such a peace that spread over parts of Germania in the years before the catastrophe. It was a success for Rome. For many Germanic tribes, it was an intermediate period in which they submitted without submission. And between these two views lay that dangerous tension that would later give rise to open violence. After Roman campaigns had passed through the region on the other side of the Rhine several times, it seemed as if the balance of power had been decided in favor of the empire. Legions had penetrated deep into Germanic territory, demonstrated their superiority in battles, set up camps, secured roads, and formed alliances with local leaders. What Rome achieved in the process was not always complete conquest in the narrower sense. Rather, a state of controlled domination emerged. Some tribe avoided open confrontation, some princes sought the proximity of the occupiers, others waited. From the outside, this could look like stability. But in truth, this calm was linked to conditions that remained unbearable for many people. Rome seldom brought order with gentle hands. Even where it did not immediately transform entire regions into regular provinces, it set signs of its power. Military presence was the first of these. Where legions were camped, it was clear to everyone who could use force whenever necessary. A Roman camp was not just a place for soldiers. It was a visible declaration of domination. Ditches, palisades, watchtowers, precisely marked out tents, orderly supplies, clear command structures. All this seemed almost like an alien kind of reality to people whose world was far less cast in permanent structural forms. The Romans did not build their power only on victory. They exhibited them. With a military presence came political interference. Rome was never content to enforce external calm. It wanted to create conditions that would remain useful in the long run. This included observing tribal leaders, balancing them against each other, promoting reliable partners, and weakening potential opponents. It also included taking hostages, concluding contracts, recruiting auxiliary troops, and exerting influence wherever local power structures could be used as leverage. For Rome, this was normal politics. For many Germanic tribes, it was an encroachment on the innermost part of their communities. For in a world in which personal honor, clan ties, and local prestige were decisive, any foreign influence directly affected the structure of power. The situation became particularly delicate when military surveillance gradually gave rise to the demand to order everyday life itself according to Roman standards. It was here that peace began to openly show its coercive character. Because rule is never just a question of soldiers. Real rule begins where it is decided who is allowed to judge, who must obey, who pays, and according to which rules conflicts are resolved. Varus and the Roman administration acted as if this step was already possible in Germania. In doing so, they crossed an invisible border. They no longer just demanded that Rome be endured. They demanded that Rome be recognized as superior. For the Romans, there was nothing unusual in this. Those who lived under Roman sovereignty had to pay taxes. Taxes were not arbitrary robbery in the eyes of the Reich, but an expression of legitimate order. They financed the presence of the state, the army, the administration, peace itself. But in Germania, such demands were not perceived as part of a common political order. They were understood as a sign of foreign availability. Whoever pays tributes to another acknowledges that this other is above him. This is precisely why the introduction of such burdens affected people more deeply than just materially. It was an attack on their status as free communities. The question of tax was not only a question of money or contributions in kind. Many Germanic tribes lived in an economy that hardly harmonized with the Roman administrative fantasies. Ownership was locally bound. Production was often geared to immediate needs. Surpluses fluctuated with season, harvest, livestock, and security. Roman officials, however, thought in terms of comprehensibility. They wanted to count, divide, demand, compare. Where Rome wanted to list, others lived on relationships. Where Rome expected fixed commitments, there were often movable, situation-dependent agreements. Precisely for this reason, every Roman uprising had to seem like an act of foreign determination, not only because it was a burden, but because it imposed a way of thinking that did not correspond to the country itself. The situation was similar with case law. In the Roman imagination, their own legal system was a sign of the highest civilization. It created procedures, responsibilities, punishments, rules that were supposed to stand above personal revenge and unclear habits. A Roman magistrate or governor who pronounced justice therefore represented not only political authority, but also the claim of moral superiority. For Germanic communities, however, this form of jurisdiction was by no means neutral. Conflicts were settled differently there, through mediation, retribution, reconciliation, assemblies, recognition of rank and tradition. Not every custom was peaceful, not every custom was just by modern standards. But they were their own forms of living together. If a foreign representative intervened in this order and decided what was law, this meant more than a legal innovation. It meant that the old standards were publicly devalued. Men who had previously had authority in the circle of their community had to watch as this authority lost weight in the face of Roman rules. Disputes that had once been settled in familiar forms were now forced under the gaze of a foreign system. The Romans might have believed that they were establishing order. Many Germanic tribes experienced it as incapacitation. But the compulsion of this peace was not only evident in institutions. It was also in the atmosphere. Wherever a foreign power is not fully integrated, but militarily superior, a climate of adaptation and silent observation arises. People learn to speak carefully. Princes weigh every word. Alliances become ambiguous. Hospitality can become a camouflage, consent to a mask. Those who openly resist risk retaliation. Anyone who connects too closely with the occupiers risks the hatred of their own people. As a result, the tribal elites in particular found themselves in a situation that often seemed stable on the outside, but was characterized by insecurity on the inside. They had to communicate with Rome without losing themselves completely to Rome. They had to calm their communities without really being able to control their emotions. For many simple free men, the situation was hardly less depressing. They lived in a world in which freedom did not exist as an abstract political concept, but as a concrete experience. No foreign master, no permanent subordination, possession of weapons, belonging to one's own community, participation in tradition. The fact that this freedom was often limited in reality by social ties, tribal rivalries, and power imbalances did not change its emotional significance. Precisely for this reason, Roman presence had to be experienced as an insult. Even if daily life was not permanently overshadowed by violence everywhere, the knowledge remained that behind every order was the power of the legion. The Roman side hardly understood this spiritual aspect. An empire that is designed for permanence learns to rationalize resistance. It often sees rebellion as irrationality, as backwardness, or as a problem of inadequate control. What makes it harder to recognize is the destructive power of violated dignity. But it was precisely this dignity that was central in Germania. A free man could endure material hardships. He was able to endure poor harvests, severe winters, feuds, and losses. But the feeling of being made small in front of strangers had a deeper effect. And Rome, often without realizing it, produced such humiliations constantly, by tone, by demands, by the claim to possess undisputed rights. In addition, even where the Romans sought cooperation, they always acted from a position of superiority. Those who negotiated with them did so under the shadow of their strength. Gifts were never just gifts, but binders. Titles were not only honors, but instruments. Military partnership rarely meant real equality. Domestic elites could take advantage of it, but the price was dependent. Some accepted it, some saw it as a necessary evil, some hoped to be able to use Rome for their own goals. But the stronger the impression arose that partnership became subordination, the more insecure the whole structure became. In this situation, a special kind of social tension arose within the Germanic world itself. For the question now was not only how to behave towards Rome, but also what future one found acceptable for one's own community. Some princes were able to count on compensation. They would like to believe that cooperation with Rome brings stability and secures their own rank. Others saw it as betrayal. Still others wavered. The tribes were not suddenly united by common hatred, but the pressure of the occupation created a new issue that affected everyone. It was no longer just local rivalries that dominated the conversations, but the larger question of whether Germania should be gradually transformed into something it had never been. It is precisely in such transitional phases that the nature of peace becomes particularly clear. As long as the Roman order promised advantages, as long as open repression failed to materialize or local conflicts could be diffused by Roman support, many things could be endured. But beneath the surface, the experience accumulated that every small step of getting used to it was also a step of loss. Today a claim to levy, tomorrow a Roman judgment, the day after tomorrow a new form of obedience. None of this had to trigger an uprising on its own. But together, these steps created a pattern. And it was this pattern that many began to understand. The Roman occupation was therefore dangerous not only because it was strong, but because it was slowly becoming normal. That's exactly what made her so threatening. A sudden attack arouses immediate resistance. A gradual acclimatization to foreign rule, on the other hand, disintegrates the feeling for the moment when resistance is still possible. Perhaps some of the Germanic leaders saw the greatest danger in this. Not that Rome would destroy them in one day, but that for years it would deprive them of those forms of life that made up their independence. If temporary occupation were to become permanent administration, then one day the moment could be missed when one could still rise up with any prospect of success. That is why the resentment did not always grow loudly, but steadily. There was murmuring in meetings. In farmsteads, people talked about the Romans, about their arrogance, their demands, their assumption that they were allowed to judge everything. Old enmities between tribes did not disappear as a result, but they faced competition from a new sense of common oppression. It had not yet become a united front, but the material for this was ready. Wounded honor, economic burden, political incapacitation, cultural contempt, and the ever-visible reminder that all this emanated from a power that saw itself as inviolable. The landscape also played a role in this peace under duress. Romans were able to build camps, secure paths, and use marsh roads. But they did not rule the country in the intimate way that the locals did. Forests, swamps, rivers, narrow passages, and seasonal changes remained a constant indication that Roman order was only imposed here. There was always a remnant of strangeness in the open presence of the occupiers. They came and went in orderly columns, bringing their standards, their tools, their commands. But the ground itself was not hers. For many Germanic tribes, this alone must have been a consolation, that the foreigners could give orders, but did not really come from the country they wanted to rule. Perhaps this was precisely the hidden contrast between Rome and Germania in these years. Rome believed that peace came about when violence was monopolized and administration was established. Germanic freedom, on the other hand, was based more on immediacy, on local ties, on power that was not completely centralized. Both sides meant something different by order. As long as this difference did not break openly, the state could look like peace. In truth, however, both were already living in different political realities. Rome saw a pacified border area in the making. Many Germans saw an occupation that seemed calm only because the right moment for the blow had not yet come. And this is exactly where the significance of this enforced peace for the rest of history begins. Because resistance rarely grows only out of hunger or fear. It often grows out of the feeling that the opponent has begun to rearrange the innermost part of one's own life. As long as Rome only threatened distantly, there was room for evasion, negotiation, distance. But the moment Roman rule began to penetrate everyday forms of coexistence, the situation changed. Military pressure became an existential question. Occupation became an imposition. In the eyes of many, cooperation turned into submission. Thus a peculiar silence lay over Germania in these years. Not a silence of trust, but a tense one. The smoke rose from the farmsteads, children grew up, merchants traveled, messages were delivered, meetings were held. Life went on. And yet something had been set in motion that could no longer simply be steered back into former equilibriums. Rome had brought peace, yes, but a peace that she maintained with military power, deepened with administration, and justified with self-assurance. For the defeated or oppressed, this peace was not the end of violence. It was their transformation into everyday life. This is the most dangerous form of calm an empire can create. For it lulls the ruler to sleep and radicalizes the ruled. Those who have to keep quiet for a long time begin to think differently. Complaints become memories, memories become convictions, convictions become plans. The uprising was not yet open. Many were still silent. Some still acted as if they could live with Rome. But under this apparent peace, the realization had long since matured that a life according to Roman conditions was not peace for many, but only a postponement. And every postponement already carries the shadow of the decision. Chapter 5. The Secret Alliance. An empire like Rome feared the open enemy less than the invisible one. Visible opponents could be counted, observed, intimidated, or destroyed. You knew where they stood, how they marched, what banners they carried. But a danger that did not appear as an army, but as a thought, as a slow unification, as a silent network of promises and mistrust, was more difficult to recognize. Exactly such a danger began to form in Germania. Not on a single thing, not in a single oath, not in a sudden wave of shared enthusiasm, but in many conversations, in cautious approaches, in shared insults, and in the growing awareness that the Romans only seemed so secure because no one had yet made a common weapon out of the fragmentation of the tribes. That was the real greatness of Arminius. Not only that he knew Rome, not only that he was of Germanic origin, but that he understood what had made the Germanic resistance weak until then. The tribes were battle-hardened, proud, and bound to their freedom, but they were not united. Each clan had its history, each tribe its own enmities, injuries, and questions of rank. Mistrust was not a state of emergency, but part of the political order. Anyone who promised unity too quickly made himself suspicious. Those who called for overarching joint action first had to prove that they did not just want to increase their own power. This is precisely why the idea of an alliance against Rome was so powerful and so difficult. Arminius could assess this difficulty better than anyone else. He knew that mere hatred of Rome was not enough. The Romans were a threat to some tribes, a temporary benefit to others, and a power to come to terms with for others. Some princes benefited from the proximity to the empire. They received recognition, protection against rivals, access to prestige, and possibly economic advantages. Others hated the Roman presence, but saw no viable path to resistance. Still others wanted neither open submission nor open risk. These differences meant that an uprising had a chance of success only if it appeared not as a romantic cry for freedom, but as a realistic, carefully prepared alternative. So Arminius first had to create something that rarely existed permanently in Germania: trust across tribal boundaries. Not perfect trust, because that would have been illusory, but just enough to make joint action possible. He had to convince men who, perhaps for years or generations, had treated each other with caution, contempt, or outright hostility. He had to address not only the anger against Rome, but also the fear of the neighbor, the fear of betrayal, the memory of old scores. And he had to do all this without attracting the attention of the Romans, who would have recognized the greatest danger in precisely such associations. It is likely that this alliance did not emerge in one place, but in stages. Arminius may have first sought out those men who felt most strongly that the enforced peace actually meant creeping incapacitation. Men whose position was threatened by the Roman administration. Men whose pride suffered from Roman arrogance. Men who realized that each further step of getting used to the occupation would make later resistance more difficult. Such men did not need long lectures on freedom. Above all, They needed the conviction that resistance was not suicide in the first place. This is where Arminius' Roman experience came into play. He could offer more than outrage. He could offer strategy. He knew that Rome was not invincible if it was forced into terrain that neutralized its strengths. He knew that legions wield their greatest power in order, provision, discipline, and predictable leadership. But he also knew how vulnerable they became when marching columns stretched, terrain cut them apart, weather weakened their mobility, and information was deceptive. In doing so, he possessed something that was rare among Germanic leaders, not only the courage to resist, but a concrete picture of how this resistance could be successful. But even that was not enough, because a plan that became known too early would have alarmed the Romans. An alliance that was too open might have been smashed with determined force before it could take effect. Arminius therefore not only had to convince, but also camouflage. He had to remain the reliable Roman ally in public, while working in secret to unite the opponents. It was precisely this dual role that made the company so extraordinarily dangerous. Every mistake, every thoughtless word, every wrong connection could have destroyed the whole work. The later success of the conspiracy shows how disciplined, controlled, and politically clever Arminius was. One must not imagine the conversations from which the alliance grew as pathetic scenes full of big words. More likely is a quiet, cautious policy. Meeting in a small group. Looks instead of oaths. Hints instead of open explanations. One man examines the other. Anyone who only complains is not yet an ally. If you hesitate, you can become a traitor tomorrow. Those who react too enthusiastically are just as dangerous as those who remain too cool. In a world where personal loyalty and political caution were closely linked, any agreement had to be formed slowly. One will have remembered earlier feuds, unreliable neighbors, princes who changed direction for advantages. And yet there was increasingly a bigger question above all this. If not now, when? Because time did not work neutrally. The longer the Romans consolidated their order, the more difficult the resistance would become. Every fortified base, every new administrative practice, every additional form of involvement of local elites reduced the tribes' room for maneuver. Perhaps this was one of Arminius' most effective arguments, not only that Rome was to be hated, but that Rome was vulnerable only in an unfinished phase. If one waited too long, provisional control would become a fixed structure. Then the tribes could only react in smaller, isolated uprisings, and would be defeated one after the other. The alliance was therefore not only a political possibility, but from the point of view of its supporters a race against time. In doing so, Arminius also had to deal with those who benefited from Rome or expected little from an uprising. Not everyone had to be ardently convinced. For some, it was perhaps enough to keep neutral. Others could be won through kinship, pressure, a sense of honor, or the prospect of prey. Still others might respond to the idea of greatness, the opportunity to become part of something that went beyond one's own tribe. Perhaps this was one of the deepest changes that this moment brought about. For the first time, the focus was not only on the honor of individual groups, but also on the idea that the fate of many tribes could be decided together. This agreement was fragile, certain. But it is precisely their fragility that makes their political importance so great. Such an alliance also needs not only shared enmity, but also a history that sustains it. Arminius probably had to convey more than tactical considerations to the men he gathered around him. He had to give them a picture of what was at stake. Not just tributes, not just legal questions, not just insults, but the future of their way of life. The question of whether their sons would still be free to live in the spirit of their fathers, whether decisions would be made in the circle of their own men or under Roman supervision, whether the order of the tribes could exist or would be replaced step by a foreign rule. Such images have a deeper effect than any sober analysis. They associate insult with purpose, fear with determination. And yet the alliance remained a risk of almost insane magnitude. Because anyone who took action against Rome had to know that failure did not only mean personal defeat. It meant retribution. Villages could be destroyed, families disempowered, hostages executed, entire regions devastated. Rome did not forgive uprisings out of negligence. It turned them into examples. Every man who joined Arminius therefore had to bring not only courage but also willingness to the utmost commitment. This is precisely where the sharpness of the secret alliance lies. It was no longer loose discontent, but the conscious decision to risk everything. Arminius' special position helped him in several ways. To the outside world, he continued to be the man whom the Romans regarded as an ally and mediator. This gave him freedom of movement. He could travel, talk, advise without immediately arousing suspicion. At the same time, his origin among the Germanic tribes gave him credibility. He was not some Roman officer who suddenly changed sides, but a Cheruscan of rank, a man of blood, name, and roots. His person combined the ability to deceive Rome with legitimacy vis-a-vis the tribes. Only a few figures of that time could have combined both in this form. It is precisely for this reason that it becomes clear in this chapter that the alliance was not only a political project, but also a feat of perception. The Romans saw stability because Arminius showed them stability. The tribes saw hope because Arminius opened up a path for them beyond mere anger. In a way, he had two completely different conversations at the same time. He spoke to the Romans as a loyal partner, to the Germanic tribes as one of their own. And in both roles he had to remain credible. This required enormous self-control. A man who operates in two worlds threatens to break easily because of the tension between them. Arminius, however, made his strongest weapon out of precisely this tension. Nevertheless, he was not the only player. An alliance lives not only from its initiator, but from those who join. It is quite conceivable that other princes and warrior leaders in turn used connections, approached relatives, worked on doubters, and integrated local networks into the larger project. It was precisely this that allowed the alliance to grow without showing itself to be centralist. Each tribe, each clan, each group brought its own motifs. Some wanted to shake off Roman taxes, others avenge personal insults, and still others wanted to save or increase their political rank. Not everyone had to fight for the same reasons. The only thing that mattered was that they would act in the same direction at the decisive moment. This kind of alliance is always precarious. It has no marble halls, no fixed offices, no archives, no openly visible chain of command. It lives from words, faces, handshakes, oaths, insinuations, and shared silence. It is strong as long as those involved believe in each other, and fragile as soon as mistrust regains the upper hand. This explains why secrecy was so central. Those who negotiate openly force people to make decisions too early. But those who work in secret give the commonweal time to take shape before external force can blow it up. Silence was probably the greatest achievement of this alliance. In a space full of local rivalries, full of people accustomed to changing loyalties, Arminius apparently succeeded in creating a circle of co-knowers and contributors that remained closed long enough. This is not a matter of course. Conspiracies often fail not because of the idea, but because of the tongue. The fact that the Romans did not fully understand in time what was contracting is an indication of how effectively this network functioned. Maybe there were warnings, maybe rumors, maybe half-clues. But they did not become strong enough to fundamentally shake Roman confidence. The alliance remained in the shadows, exactly where it could have its effect. At the same time, Arminius had to make it clear to his allies that patience was part of the plan. This is often the most difficult point of any conspiracy. Those who are angry want to act. Those who feel humiliated do not want to wait any longer. But impatient force would have alarmed the Romans and brought their military superiority back into play. So the alliance had to be not only secret, but disciplined. It was not allowed to break down due to individual attacks or premature outbreaks. The blow only had to be made when terrain, movement, deception, and surprise interacted. This ability to transform collective anger into strategic restraint shows how strongly Arminius was already influencing his comrades in arms. Thus, the secret alliance gradually became more than a loose agreement. It became a new political space. One that was not based on permanent institutions, but on a common goal. In this room, something emerged for a moment that was otherwise obscured by tribal interests: the insight that freedom only had a chance if it was defended together. One should not romanticize this moment. It was not a modern national idea, no lasting unity, no end to all internal conflicts. But it was a rare condensation. For a decisive historical moment, Rome began to no longer only have the fragmented north against it, but to help force it together under itself. And with that, the actual foundation stone for the later catastrophe was laid. Not in the forest. Not in the rain. Not in the first javelin throw. But here, in the quiet work of the alliance. In the decision to put rivalry on the back burner. In the readiness to follow a man who knew both sides. In the growing confidence that Rome, despite its power, could be brought into a position in which discipline lost to narrowness, pride to terrain, and superiority to deception. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is no battle, but a silence full of meaning. Rome still sees individual tribes, individual clients, individual problems. Arminius already sees a net. The men who join him may not see all the way yet, but they do see the possibility that the seemingly unflappable adversary is vulnerable. Between the trees, at fireplaces, in meetings and away from the Roman gaze, distrust slowly grows into determination. Determination becomes an appointment. Appointment becomes alliance. And every covenant born in the shadows lives on a single promise: that the moment will come when the hidden becomes visible with full force. Chapter 6: Friendship and Mistrust. The most dangerous turning points in history often occur not where two enemies are openly opposed to each other, but where trust still seems intact even though it has already disintegrated internally. There was just such a tension between Arminius and Varus. To the outside world, they were linked by cooperation, mutual benefit, and presumably a degree of personal reliability that was indispensable in border regions between governors and local leaders. But beneath this surface, another process has long been at work. While Varus saw Arminius as a valuable partner, Arminius used this trust to create the conditions for Rome's downfall in Germania. It was a relationship in which closeness and deception did not exist side by side, but were inseparably intertwined. For a Roman governor, a man like Arminius was a gift. He was not just any local ally, but a prince's son with Roman education, military experience, and an understanding of both sides that made him particularly valuable in the eyes of the Romans. Such men were able to diffuse tensions, provide information, convey messages, and create the impression that the integration of Germania into the Roman order was progressing peacefully. Where an ordinary tribal leader might have had limited credibility, Arminius combined several roles in one person. He was indigenous enough to have influence among Germanic tribes, and Roman enough to be considered reliable in the governor's camp. Varus needed such figures. Not because he was weak, but because every ruler on a troubled border is dependent on mediation. No governor could oversee every valley, every feud, every mood, and every local power relationship. He had to rely on his eyes and ears, on men who recognized earlier where resistance was growing or where cooperation was possible. Arminius was almost ideal in this respect. He was able to translate Roman intentions into a language that was understood in Germania. At the same time, he was able to interpret Germanic reactions and convey them to the governor. So he became not only an ally, but a hinge between worlds. And it was precisely this position that made his later actions so devastating. It is quite conceivable that Varus did not simply trust him in the abstract, but relied on him in a very concrete way in the everyday life of the political and military business. Trust rarely arises from rank or recommendation alone. It grows through repeated reliability, through successful mediation, through useful hints, through the absence of disappointments. Perhaps Arminius had repeatedly proven that he could correctly assess moods. Perhaps he had appeased conflicts or opened up paths that gave the Romans the impression that they were gradually establishing order in Germania. Perhaps it was precisely his calm self-control that was decisive. Men who don't seem too eager, not too submissive, not too conspicuously loyal often seem the most credible. Arminius did not have to flatter. It was enough to be useful. This shows how close friendship and mistrust can be in such borderline relationships. For even if Varus trusted Arminius, this trust would hardly have been blind and sentimental. A Roman governor knew in principle that local elites had their own interests. He knew that loyalty was never completely free of calculation. But the Roman system was accustomed to working with precisely this kind of calculated loyalty. It was enough for a man to derive more long-term benefits from proximity to Rome than from hostility to Rome. Varus probably did not consider Arminius to be completely selfless, but he was wise enough to link his own rise to the success of Roman rule. That was exactly the fatal error. Because Arminius didn't just play a role. He lived in a double reality that was becoming more and more dangerous. On the one hand, there was Roman confidence, which gave him freedom of movement, access, and influence. On the other hand, his secret alliance with those forces that wanted to beat Rome out of Germania grew. This dual role required more than tactical sense. She demanded an almost frightening self-control. Every look, every conversation, every gesture had to be balanced. He was not allowed to appear too distant or too zealous towards Varus. He was not allowed to give his Germanic allies the impression that he would remain trapped in the Roman net. He had to be credible on both sides and prevent one side from even suspecting how far the other already projected into his thinking. Perhaps Arminius' greatest art was not to let the distrust of others disappear, but to direct it in such a way that it never reached the decisive point. Because complete trust is rare, especially in political border areas. In the Roman camp, too, there must have been men who were generally more skeptical of Germanic tribes, who saw Arminius less as a partner than as a useful stranger. Perhaps there were also voices on the Germanic side asking whether a man who had lived and served with Romans for so long could really be one of their own. So Arminius didn't have to win everyone's hearts. It was enough to keep doubts under control to such an extent that they did not destroy his ability to act. In this field of tension, every encounter with Varus gained additional weight. You have to imagine what it meant to face a man who is counting on you while you are already secretly preparing for defeat. Such situations have something almost theatrical about them, but in reality they are usually silent. An exchange about paths, about local unrest, about political assessments. Perhaps joint consultation on measures. Perhaps objective discussions about security and administration. In such moments, Varus must have believed that he was working with an indispensable ally. Arminius, on the other hand, must have weighed every word with the knowledge that this very normality was the cover for something much bigger. Nevertheless, it would be too easy to describe this relationship only as a cold deception. People who cooperate over a long period of time almost inevitably develop forms of closeness, even if their interests diverge at some point. Perhaps Varus honestly respected Arminius' abilities. Perhaps he appreciated in him the mixture of intelligence, leadership, and borderline experience that he himself lacked. And perhaps Arminius also saw in Varus not just the abstract symbol of an empire, but a concrete man, proud, dutiful, convinced of Rome, but not necessarily cruel in his personal dealings. That would have made the situation more complicated internally. Betrayal is not always easier when the deceived person is despised. Sometimes it is most difficult when the other person remains recognizable in his humanity. But personal complexity does not change political determination. If Arminius had long since decided to defeat Rome in Germania, then every bond to Varus had to become instrumental in the end. Not because he must have been callous, but because his greater loyalty already lay elsewhere. That is the grim truth of such historical constellations. Friendship, respect, shared experience. All of this can endure and still be displaced by an overarching goal. Arminius could certainly understand Varus as a man and perhaps even respect him. But precisely because he understood how Romans thought, he also had to know that there was nothing to be gained by half measures. Anyone who wanted to succeed against Rome could not be stopped by the appearance of human proximity. Meanwhile, the balance of power continued to shift in secret. The deeper Arminius went into the preparations for his alliance, the more his relationship with Varus himself became a weapon. Information he received helped him determine the right time. The trust placed in him allowed him to dispel suspicions and explain movements credibly. Where an obvious opponent would have been immediately observed, Arminius could act dangerously freely precisely because of his proximity to the governor. Thus, in such moments, trust turns into what it should never be from the point of view of the betrayed, into a weak point. The Romans, on the other hand, were so used to precisely this kind of mediation that they may have underestimated its risks. An empire can only grow if it involves people at its edges. Without local allies, it would have to control everything on its own, which would not be possible in the long term, either politically or militarily. That is why Rome had learned to integrate elites and give them responsibility. This often worked surprisingly well. But every successful method carries the risk that it will eventually be considered foolproof. In Arminius, Rome encountered the rare case that an integrated ally not only developed disloyalty, but also understood the mechanisms of integration itself and turned them against the empire. Perhaps the first warning signs appeared in this phase. It is conceivable that some reports indicated unrest, that individual voices warned against too much trust, that rivals of Arminius or skeptical observers drew the governor's attention to possible dangers. But warning signs are only as effective as the willingness to take them seriously. And this is exactly where Arminius' skill met Varus' way of thinking. For Varus, the idea of comprehensive betrayal probably did not fit into the image he had of Germania. Individual disturbances, yes. Local tensions, certainly. But a man he trusts as the center of a larger conspiracy? This must have seemed unlikely, precisely because it called into question the foundation of his entire border policy. So both men lived in the same reality and yet in two completely different interpretations of this reality. Varus saw cooperation where infiltration was already taking place. Arminius saw an opportunity where Varus suspected normality. This doubling gives chapter 6 its real tension. It is the chapter of the break that is not yet visible. Everything seems formally ordered. Conversations take place, structures exist, roles are distributed. And yet it is precisely this order that has already been undermined. In a way, the catastrophe does not start later. It is already there, in the form of a trust that still works, although it has long since been abused internally. For the Germanic side, this proximity between Arminius and Varus was also of enormous importance. Those who joined the secret alliance had to trust that Arminius could really use his position in the Roman camp without losing himself in it. This is precisely what should not have been a matter of course. A man who is too close to the enemy quickly looks suspicious. Perhaps some allies had to ask themselves again and again whether Arminius really went their way or whether he would ultimately decide in favor of Rome. It was all the more decisive that his access to Varus did not appear as a flaw, but as a trump card. Arminius had to prove that it was precisely his proximity to the governor that made the coming blow possible in the first place. Not despite, but because of this trust, Rome was to become vulnerable. This shows another level of mistrust. It ran not only between Romans and Germanic tribes, but through both camps. On the Roman side, there may have been silent reservations about local allies. On the Germanic side, reservations about a man with a Roman past. Arminius was at the center of all these doubts and could never let them get completely out of balance. Perhaps this explains his later success. He was not only militarily or politically skilled, but psychologically extraordinarily precise. He understood what people needed to hear in order to stay calm, what they hoped for, what they feared, and how to direct their perception without forcing them openly. The longer this phase lasted, the greater the risk that some coincidence could destroy everything. A thoughtless remark, an intercepted messenger, an outbreak of violence too early, a misunderstood meeting, all this would have been enough to force Varus to rethink. Then trust might have turned into vigilance. But history decided otherwise. The fragile balance still held. Arminius could still speak to Varus as if there were no abyss between them. Varus could still regard the Cheruscan as a pillar of his politics. It is precisely in this uncanny stability that the drama of the moment lies. Everything depends on the fact that one man does not read the other correctly. Perhaps this chapter can therefore best be understood as a story of a misunderstood closeness. Varus believed that Arminius' Roman experience made him more reliable. In truth, it made him more dangerous. Arminius used the appearance of allegiance not only to gain information, but to keep the Romans in a security that blinded them. Friendship, insofar as it existed, thus became a shell. Mistrust, as far as it existed, remained insufficient. Neither genuine trust nor open suspicion completely determined the relationship. Instead, there was a gray area, and it was precisely in this gray area that the decision was prepared. Because history rarely tips at the moment when weapons are raised. It topples much earlier when people are mistaken about the nature of their relationship. Varus believed in a kind of cooperation that no longer existed in Germania. Arminius had long lived in the logic of rupture, even if his face still bore the calmness of an ally. Everything that was to happen later in the forest was rooted in this disparity of perceptions. It wasn't the first attack that was the real beginning of the downfall, but the fact that Varus thought his most dangerous threat was a helper. So this chapter ends in a silence that could hardly be more deceptive. There still seems to be an understanding between the governor and the prince's son. Words are exchanged, trust seems intact, the order of the Roman camp remains. But beneath this surface, the relationship has already changed. What was once cooperation is now camouflage. What looks like reliability has already become a trap. And what Varus interprets as a sign of successful integration is in truth the sharpest expression of his error. Arminius was close enough to Varus to understand him. And Varus trusted Arminius deeply enough to perish from it. Chapter 7, Thusnelda. Great historical upheavals are often told as if they consisted only of generals, alliances, marching routes and decisions of men who determine war and peace. But history never arises solely in the realms of power. It also grows in families, in love affairs, in rivalries between fathers and daughters, in wounded pride and in that quiet realm of humanity that often remains invisible even though it can have political consequences. Thusnelda belongs exactly in this room. She is not just a marginal figure in the shadow of the well-known male names, but a figure who shows how closely the personal was interwoven with the political in that world. In their story, love, loyalty, origin, and resistance intersect. And it is precisely through this that the conflict over Germania acquires a deeper, more human sharpness. Thusnelda was the daughter of the Cheruscan nobleman Segestes, a man who embodied a different attitude towards Rome than Arminius in the years before the catastrophe. Where Arminius took the path of covert resistance, Segestes stood more for those forces within the Germanic world that wanted to come to terms with the Roman presence or at least accepted it as a political reality. This did not necessarily mean submissiveness in the simple sense. Men like Segestes acted out of a different form of prudence. They recognized the greatness of Rome, its military strength, its reach, and the risks of an open insurrection. Perhaps they believed that one had to live with Rome if one wanted to maintain the position of one's own house. Perhaps they did not see shame in the proximity to Rome, but protection against internal rivals. In any case, Segestes was a man who sought a balance with foreign power rather than an open rupture. That's why his daughter wasn't just a daughter. In a society in which descent, rank and alliances were of central political importance, a woman from a leading house was also part of the power structure. Marriages were not just private unions. They could strengthen alliances, alleviate tensions, or deepen conflicts. Whoever married Thusnelda gained more than one wife. He gained closeness to a certain political camp, to a family, to a status, to a network of relationships. The fact that Arminius, of all people, was associated with her was therefore far more than a love story from the very beginning. It was an event with explosive power. Historically, we know little about Thusnelda's personality with absolute certainty. But precisely because the tradition leaves gaps, it does not have to be made a mere projection surface. It is plausible to think of her as a woman of rank, self-confidence, and political alertness. In a world where decisions were made by men in public, this did not mean that women remained passive and clueless. They lived in the midst of the consequences of these decisions. They knew the tensions of their families, knew about alliances and enmities, felt shifts in power early on, and were often carriers of dynastic importance themselves. A woman like Thusnelda will not only have borne her father's name. She must have known what this name meant. And then Arminius came into her life. This is where the inner condensation begins, which makes chapter 7 so important. For Arminius was not just any man. He was already a figure of transition himself, a Germanic prince's son, formed in Rome, militarily experienced, ambitious, charismatic, dangerous. It contained that mixture of familiarity and strangeness that attracts and unsettles people at the same time. For Thusnelda, he must have been more than an ordinary applicant. He was a man of rank, but also of mystery. Someone who stood in the middle of time, not next to her. One that could break the future of the Cherusci and perhaps large parts of Germania. The fact that a connection developed between the two was therefore almost inevitably politically significant, even if it grew out of genuine affection. It was precisely this connection that Segests had to perceive as a threat. For Arminius was not only a potential son-in-law for him, but a man whose direction he presumably observed with growing suspicion. Perhaps Segests saw in him an ambitious rival. Perhaps he recognized in him the restlessness that led away from the Romans and towards a dangerous resistance. Perhaps it was also personal pride, a father's resistance to a man who did not conform to the order he himself thought was wiser. In any case, there was more between Segests and Arminius than mere political disagreement. In Thusnelda, this contrast was given a face, a family, an emotional center. Thus, a private bond became an open break in the innermost part of the Cheruscan nobility. One can imagine how each gesture gained weight as a result. Wooing was not just courtship. An agreement was not just affection. A refusal was not merely paternal concern. Everything was marked by greater loyalties. Who does Thusnelda love? Just a man, or also what he stands for? Is she only opposing her father out of personal feeling, or is she making a political choice at the same time? And what does it mean for Arminius if the woman with whom he connects comes from a house that in his thinking stands more for rapprochement with Rome than for resistance? It would be wrong to see Thusnelda only as a prize or symbol in this field of tension. It is precisely the appeal of her character that lies in the fact that she as a person stands between these fronts and thus becomes a decision herself. When she turns to Arminius, she does not decide in a vacuum. She detaches herself from her father's attitude, at least inwardly. She crosses a line that is visible in the political structure of her world. Perhaps this is done out of love, perhaps out of admiration, perhaps also because she recognizes in Arminius a greatness that the more cautious thinking of Segests lacks. It is even possible that she sees the Roman danger more clearly than her father and recognizes in Arminius not only the man, but also the answer to a threatening future. Whatever the exact inner weight was, her connection to Arminius thus acquires a political dignity of its own kind. It is precisely because it is personal that it becomes historically significant. In a world driven by loyalties, love relationships are never completely private. They change the web of affiliations. Thusnelda becomes not only a companion for Arminius, but also a sign that his path is attracting even influential families. For Segests, on the other hand, she embodies the painful loss of influence in her own house. What may seem like a family affair from the outside is in fact a process with political echoes. Because when daughter and father find themselves at odds over such a central connection, it shows that the larger conflict has long since penetrated into the most intimate spaces of society. It is possible that the connection between Arminius and Thusnelda was overshadowed by drama from the beginning. Some traditions suggest that Segests did not agree with the union and that there was a break that went beyond mere displeasure. That fits the structure of the time. A father like Segests would hardly have understood the election of his daughter as a purely personal right. It affected the house, politics, the balance of alliances. A daughter who nevertheless committed herself to Arminius thus evaded not only his will, but also his political order. This is precisely where the power of this story lies. Love does not appear as a soft counterworld to power, but as a form of decision within power. Thus, in this chapter, Thusnelda introduces something into the narrative that has so far been considered primarily from the perspective of men: the price of resistance in the private sphere. Arminius builds alliances, plans deception, moves between Rome and Germania. But what does this mean for a person who is close to him? A person who may not know all the details of his inner path, but feels the tension of his life? Thusnelda must have realized that the man at her side was not heading for safety. Those who were associated with Arminius did not associate themselves with a quiet ascent within orderly conditions, but with a path that led to danger, rupture, and violence. Precisely for this reason, her closeness to him is an expression of courage, not just feeling. Perhaps it was precisely this knowledge that deepened their relationship. People love not only in spite of danger, but sometimes especially intensely in their presence. If Arminius already entered the shadow of the conspiracy, then his peace must never have been completely unencumbered. He had to hide, plan, remain silent, play roles. For someone who was really close to him, such inner tensions were probably palpable, even without any open explanation. Thusnelda could have been one of the few people before whom Arminius did not have to be completely masked. And if so, then their connection took on an additional depth. It was not only politically sensitive, but also a possible place of truth in the midst of general deception. At the same time, the figure of Segestes remains above her like a shadow. In this constellation, the father stands not only for family authority, but also for the alternative future of Germania. A future of adaptation, of arrangement, of dealing with Rome, renouncing the great rupture. Thusnelda and Arminius, on the other hand, stand for something else, for crossing the line, for risk, for refusing to fit into an alien order. Thus, the family conflict becomes almost a political allegory. Father and daughter do not simply embody different temperaments, but different answers to the question of how an endangered people should live. And yet it remains crucial that Thusnelda does not become a mere allegory. She is not only the daughter of one, or the wife of the other. It gives the material an emotional grounding. Through them, it becomes noticeable that the coming conflict will not only decide on territories and legions, but also on ties, belonging, and the loss of the familiar. A war that divides families does not begin with the first attack. It begins where people can no longer meet each other in the same political world. Thusnelda lives exactly on this fault line. Her view of father and lover must have been marked by incompatibility from the very beginning. From a dramaturgical point of view, she thus opens up a level that gives the script great power. Because while the men think in terms of alliances, administration, and marching, Thusnelda condenses the conflict to a human scale. In her figure, it can become visible what political decisions mean at their core: the fear of loss, the harshness of conflicts of loyalty, the quiet determination to choose a path, even though it means a break with one's origins. A scene between Thusnelda and Segestes can say more about the division of Germania than a whole council of tribal leaders. A scene between Thusnelda and Arminius can show more clearly what is at stake than many speeches about freedom. Because where love and history meet, the abstract suddenly becomes concrete. One may ask oneself what effect Thusnelda could have had on Arminius himself. A man who prepares for betrayal, war, and deception not only needs strategic clarity. He also needs a reason for which the risk is worthwhile. In this sense, Thusnelda could have been more to him than private closeness. In it, the future and homeland were combined. Not the abstract Germania of which legends later speak, but something tangible, family continuity, the life that was to remain possible without Roman rule. It is precisely because of this that the relationship becomes the emotional antithesis of the Roman world. Rome offers rank, order, career. Thusnelda stands for attachment, origin, idiosyncrasy, perhaps also for the possibility of a life that does not merge into Roman categories. This also gives this chapter a symbolic beauty. Arminius, the man between two worlds, finds support in a woman who binds him back to the side of his origins, not as a relapse into the past, but as a decision for a future outside Rome. Thusnelda, on the other hand, frees herself from the influence of a father who relies on adaptation and stands by the side of a man who dares to break up. This creates an axis between the two that goes beyond individual feeling. She embodies the point at which personal loyalty and political will support each other. But this is precisely where tragedy lies. Because those who love each other in such times never live in protected privacy. Every affection is under observation. Every closeness is threatened by external danger. Thusnelda cannot simply love Arminius as one loves in quiet times. She loves a man whose path creates enemies, whose decisions can end in blood, whose future is uncertain. This gives her story a heaviness that goes far beyond romantic embellishment. She makes it clear that the coming storm will not only shake empires, but will tear people out of their family and emotional balance. Thusnelda stands at the end of this chapter as a character who bundles the whole drama in a human way. In it, daughter and lover, origin and departure, closeness and decision meet. It brings warmth to a story that could otherwise easily freeze in strategy and power thinking. At the same time, it increases the height of the fall. Because if the conflict escalates, not only will Rome stand against Germania, but also father against daughter, house against house, private ties against political order. Thusnelda makes it clear that no major historical break ever takes place only on the public stage. It always runs through hearts, families, and those quiet relationships from which people draw their deepest strength. And perhaps that is their real place in this narrative, not on the margins, but in the center of the human. While alliances are already consolidating in the background and betrayal is preparing its way, Thusnelda reminds us of what freedom means to people in the first place. Not only the lack of foreign rule, but the possibility of loving, choosing, and living without every decision already being subject to the will of an empire. In this way, her story does not become a subplot, but a mirror of the whole. Because sometimes a woman between father and lover explains an age better than any legion on the march. Chapter 8: Signs of the Storm. Before a catastrophe becomes visible, it rarely announces itself in unambiguous forms. It does not come with a single voice, not with a clear call, not with an openly declared beginning. Usually, it is only noticeable as a change in the atmosphere at first. People notice that conversations are becoming more cautious, that glances rest on each other longer, that news travels strangely fast or conspicuously slowly. The air seems heavier, decisions are becoming more uncertain, and things that seemed commonplace yesterday suddenly have an aftertaste of meaning. It is precisely in such an interval that Chapter 8 begins. It is the chapter of omens. The trap has not yet snapped shut. No legions are marching to its doom yet. But the world before the battle is already not the same as before. In Germania, signs never meant only sober information. The people of that time lived in a reality in which nature, fate, and divine were thought to be more closely connected than is usual in a modern, rationalized world. This was true for Romans as well as for Germanic tribes, albeit in different forms. Romans had sacrifices interpreted, observed celestial phenomena, paid attention to sacred signs, and looked for clues to the attitude of the gods in unusual events. Germanic communities, on the other hand, lived in particularly close connection with the landscape, with the forest, the weather, the seasons, and the places that carried not only space but meaning. So when the tension intensified before the coming blow, it was not only perceived as a political process. It penetrated into the entire perceptual fabric of people. Rumors were among the first signs. In border areas and under occupation, rumors are never just unreliable words. They are a political medium in their own right. They carry what cannot yet be said openly. They connect courtyards, fireplaces, gatherings, and campsites that are far apart from each other. A rumor can spread fear, inspire hope, test who reacts how, or prepare the ground for later decisions. In the weeks before the collapse of Roman certainty, such rumors must have been everywhere. Not loud enough to be unambiguous, but clear enough to create unrest. One may have spoken of movements in remote areas, of armed groups, of conversations between men who otherwise avoided each other, of signs of lack of subservience, of strangely reserved answers. None of this had to betray the uprising on its own. But together, they created a pattern that was felt by those who had to learn to hear between the words. Arminius himself must have lived with double attention during this phase. On the one hand, he had to coordinate his allies and ensure that the already woven threads of the secret alliance did not become visible too soon. On the other hand, he could not show any nervousness towards Varus and the Romans. Just now, shortly before the decision, every little thing became dangerous. A man who usually spoke calmly and suddenly seemed evasive could arouse suspicion. A tribe that gathered too early could provoke military countermeasures. A thoughtless attack on a small Roman unit could have destroyed the whole plan. The time of signs was therefore also the time of the greatest discipline. It was no longer enough for the men to have the will to resist. They had to be able to hold him back. But it is not only people who change their behavior. Nature also became more prominent during these days. The summer was coming to an end, the weather was becoming more changeable, humid air was moving through the forests, rain was on the horizon or had already begun. In a country like Germania, weather was not just a background. It determined paths, speed, supply, visibility, exhaustion. This was nothing new for the locals. They knew the ground, the yielding of the path, the treacherous heaviness of the mud, the sound of wet forests, the speed with which a seemingly harmless path could become an obstacle under the rain. For the Romans, on the other hand, whose military strength depended on structure, predictability, and order of movement, weather was always a logistical factor. The wetter, narrower, and more confusing the terrain became, the easier it was to undermine their superiority. It is therefore no coincidence that nature later appears almost as an actor in its own right in the memory of the battle. Even before the first decisive blow is struck, she begins to side with those who know her better. The forest is becoming denser, paths seem more unsafe, water collects in depressions, the air presses heavily on people and animals. One could say that the country itself is beginning to lose its impartiality. For Arminius and his allies, this was more than a practical advantage. It was part of the whole plan, perhaps even something that made the men feel that they were acting not only on their own merits, but in harmony with a space that stood against the intruder. Such perceptions are intensified in times of tension. When people think they are on the threshold of a great event, they read the world differently. Every sudden gust of wind, every unusual animal behavior, every silence in the forest can take on meaning. For Romans and Germanic tribes, neither of whom lived in a disenchanted world, omens and signs were not a minor matter. A bird migration, a failed sacrifice, a dream, an unexpected celestial phenomenon or a disturbing natural phenomenon could be interpreted as a warning or promise. You don't have to know what concrete signs individual people perceived at that time or later remembered to understand that a time like this must have been full of interpretations. Maybe some men slept badly. Perhaps women and old people told each other about strange dreams. Perhaps animals seemed restless, dogs attacked earlier, horses became more nervous. Such things would be inconsequential or accidental in modern eyes, but in a world of intense symbolic attention, they carried weight. In the face of a war that is not openly announced, the importance of ambiguity grows. What you don't hear in commands, you look for in signs. What may not yet be said publicly seems to be indicated in the weather, in voices, and in the mood of the country. This phase must have been strange in the Roman camp as well. The daily routines probably continued. Orders were given, reports exchanged, decisions prepared. Perhaps the situation still seemed controlled to the outside world. But border areas also send signals to the rulers, even if they do not fully understand them. Non-commissioned officers may have noticed unrest, scouts may have made vague observations, allies may have given unclear clues. Perhaps there were reports of minor incidents, of tensions among tribes, of local uprisings or movements that needed a reaction. It is precisely in such moments that it is decided whether a governor reads the signs as part of a greater danger or classifies them in the familiar category of ordinary restlessness. Varus, it seems, remained attached to the second glance. For him, Many of the incidents probably fit into the image of a region that is still fundamentally controllable. And yet even in him there must have been a remnant of vigilance. No Roman commander moved completely blindly through unsafe land. The question was not whether he ignored every sign, but how he interpreted them. Varus was accustomed to thinking of unrest in both administrative and military terms. If difficulties arose somewhere, you had to march there, establish order, react with authority. This was precisely where his vulnerability lay. Because the signs of the storm were not set to make him retreat. They were directed in such a way that they set it in motion, and in a way that benefited the conspirators. This is the perfidious beauty of Arminius' plan. The signs of danger were not to trigger an alarm in the strategic sense, but to provoke a Roman reaction that had been anticipated and built into the trap. This is also the difference between warning and lure. What may have been a disturbing sign for some, perhaps seemed to Varus to be an occasion for decisive intervention. Reports about unrest in a certain area, about a disruptive factor that had to be brought under control quickly, could seem credible precisely because they fit into the normal scheme of thought of Roman rule. A governor who embodies order must not allow himself to be paralyzed by every rumor. He has to act. Arminius knew that. He knew the logic of Roman action well enough to understand that Varus should not be lured with too great a threat. Too obvious a danger would have caused caution. A limited, plausible restlessness, on the other hand, evoked exactly what was needed, a march with a feeling of having the situation under control. Among the Germanic allies, the mood was probably characterized by a completely different kind of tension. There, the same signs did not seem manageable, but promising and frightening at the same time. Everyone knew that the decision was getting closer. Everyone also knew that there was no turning back once the mechanism was set in motion. The secret alliance had long lived on restraint, on silence, on postponement. But now all this had to become one thing: action. This threshold is the most delicate moment for any conspiracy. As long as you plan, the future remains open. As soon as you act, fate and chance are part of the story. The signs of the storm were therefore not only external harbingers, but also internal tests. Anyone who hesitated now endangered everyone. Those who started too early, as well. Perhaps individual groups gathered secretly during these days, checked weapons, exchanged final messages. Perhaps men looked at each other and knew that they would soon set off either to freedom or to destruction. Such moments often carry an almost unbearable density. The world seems to go on as normal, and yet everything already feels irrevocable. It is precisely the contrast that makes the tension so great. Children are still playing in front of the farmsteads, women are doing the daily work, smoke is rising, animals are being cared for. At the same time, a few know that this normality will soon break down. Everyday life still lies over the country like a blanket, but underneath it is already glowing with what is to come. In this context, Thusnelda also acquires a quiet significance, even if she is not at the center of military action in this chapter. People like her, who were close to Arminius, must have sensed that the unrest was intensifying. Maybe not in all the details of the plan, but in the way someone changes when they are heading towards a decision. The closer the moment came, the harder the silence must have become. Closeness and mystery then enter into a painful relationship. Those who love notice change, but often cannot know everything. Thus, the tension of the coming storm runs not only through political and military spheres, but through relationships, looks, unspoken fears. The landscape itself almost seems to be listening in such moments. Forests have always had a special power in the human imagination, especially when decisions mature in secret. In the open field, everything is visible, more predictable, more orderly. The forest, on the other hand, hides. He picks up sounds, breaks lines of sight, swallows certainties. For the Romans, the Germanic forest must have had something uncomfortable and resistant in this phase anyway. Not only because it was militarily impractical, but because it eluded their clear order. For the Germanic tribes, on the other hand, he was home, protection, and accomplice. When the storm was announced, It was not over open plains and on wide streets, but in a space that was inherently opposed to imperial transparency. Thus, in Chapter 8, different types of signs condense into a large precursor to the decision. There are political signs, rumors, movements, cautious shifts in loyalty. There are human signs, nervousness, silence, looks, restless nights, the knowledge of an approaching risk. There are natural signs, rain, wind, oppressive air, impassable ground, the darker attitude of the land. And there are religious symbolic signs, omens, dreams, interpretations, the feeling that something bigger is laying over the scene. None of these levels alone explains the story, but together they create the atmosphere in which the coming blow does not seem sudden, but inevitable. This is precisely what makes this chapter so important. It is the last threshold before the open path to perdition. Nothing has been decided yet, and yet everything already seems to be in motion. The Romans may still feel strong enough to control any disturbance. The conspirators know that their time has come. Nature prepares conditions that neither side can completely control, but which will benefit one more than the other. Above all lies the peculiar silence that is not peace, but recollection. You could say that the battle doesn't start with the first attack. It begins here, in the world of omens, in which people and landscape change at the same time, in which certainties become porous and decisions still remain invisible, in which the weather becomes heavier, words more cautious, paths darker and hearts more restless, in which the order of Rome still stands upright, but is already surrounded by forces that will soon hit it in a space it has never really understood. The storm does not announce itself to be heard. He announces himself so that those who prepare him know that his hour has come. Chapter 9. The March into the Unknown. There are moments in history when a decision seems routine to the outside world, but in reality already marks the path to disaster. Not every defeat begins with the first blow of the enemy. Some start with an order to leave, with a choice of direction, with the calm belief that they have the situation under control. For Varus and his legions, just such a moment had come. What may have seemed like a necessary march for the restoration of order on the Roman side was in reality already the entry into a space that others had prepared. Chapter 9, therefore, not only tells of the departure of an army. It tells the story of an empire that sets itself in motion, not realizing that every one of its strengths would be turned into weakness along the way. The reason for the march had to seem plausible from a Roman point of view. It was not without reason that a governor like Varus moved through difficult terrain with significant forces. An occasion was needed that fit into the logic of imperial rule, reports of unrest, of an uprising, or of disturbances that required decisive intervention. It was precisely in this plausibility that the elegance of Arminius' deception lay. The reports had to be credible enough to trigger action, but not so threatening that Varus fundamentally changed his attitude and marched in highly secured combat readiness or on an alternative route. The Roman reaction was not to be prevented, but directed. Varus was to leave, convinced that he would order a controllable situation. For a man like him, this was only logical. Order that is challenged must be revealed. A governor cannot hesitate when a territory that he already considers to be in Roman hands suddenly shows signs of unrest. In his eyes, it is precisely the determination with which he reacts that confirms the rule itself. A Roman Empire that responds to every rumor with retreat would lose the magic of its power. So they marched. They showed presence. Obedience was restored. This was not unusual, but part of the political and military everyday life in which Rome had grown up. And yet this time something was different. This time, the path itself was already part of the opponent's plan. The troop that set off was impressive. 3 legions, plus auxiliary troops, escorts, servants, entourage, animals, wagons, and all the material that a Roman march brought with it. A legion was not a mere collection of armed men. It was an orderly machine of officers, non-commissioned officers, experienced soldiers, equipment, tools, and routines. 3 legions therefore meant not only numerical strength, but a piece of the empire itself in marching form. These men carried Rome with them, his discipline, his hierarchy, his habit of putting order on foreign soil. Precisely for this reason, their departure probably did not seem like a risk, but like the self-evident execution of Roman power. But the size of this march was also his first vulnerability. An army of this kind did not move like a small powerful elite unit, but as a long multi-limbed organism. As soon as soldiers, auxiliary troops, entourage, animals and supplies were on the road together, a column was formed whose mobility was limited. On wide roads or in open terrain, this mass could still be led in an orderly manner. In a narrow, difficult country, however, order quickly turned into stretching. Stretch became gap. Gap turned into confusion. That was exactly what Arminius had bet on. It was not the Romans who were to be weak, but their strength was to fall into an environment that cut them apart. At the beginning of the march, however, little of this was likely to have been visible. The soldiers were experienced. Many had already survived difficult missions. They trusted in their equipment, their guides, and their routines. Marching was not an exception for legionnaires, but everyday life. They knew the burden, rain, fatigue, and the hardships of long distances. The Roman army was so feared precisely because it could not only fight, but also move in an orderly manner over large areas. To a simple soldier, this move might at first seem like another mission, uncomfortable, perhaps unpleasant, but nothing that shook the principle that Rome would prevail in the end. It is precisely in this normality that the silent horror of the chapter lies. Because the catastrophe is not built up out of open panic, but out of the self-evident nature of an army that sees its own processes as protection. Men fasten their equipment, animals are harnessed, orders are passed on, columns are arranged, marching lines are formed. Everything seems like military routine. And yet each of these steps is already part of a path that others have thought through. The Romans don't just march through one country. They march into a perception that they themselves do not share. The terrain is difficult for them. It is prepared for their opponents. Arminius' role at this moment is particularly impressive. He is apparently still within the circle of Roman trust. He can still give hints, accompany, advise, interpret the situation. It is precisely now, at the moment of departure, that his double game must have reached its highest tension. He faces an army that trusts him, and at the same time knows that every step of this army leads him closer to destruction. This requires not only coldness, but almost superhuman control, because the march also marks the beginning of a zone of no return for him. As long as the legions were still safe, much could perhaps have been broken off. Now, however, the mechanics of the plan are visibly set in motion. Preparations turn into movement. Movement becomes fate. The path Varus chose or had chosen was decisive. Perhaps it seemed shorter, more practical, or politically necessary. Perhaps its course could be explained by the reported riots. Perhaps they believed that they could use it to intervene quickly where danger threatened. Whatever the individual considerations were, it is important that the march was not limited to a completely secure, wide, ideally controllable route. It led through regions where the terrain became narrower, more unpredictable, and increasingly difficult for orderly mass movement. This was a disadvantage for the Romans, but not one that would necessarily have destroyed their confidence. An army of this strength could endure a lot. But the further it moved into difficult space, the more its vulnerability became structural. Because a Roman march lives from overview. It must be possible to pass on an officer's orders. Units have to stay together, form up if necessary, react to attacks, protect the wounded, secure cars. The more the terrain breaks lines of sight and pulls the column apart, the more the possibility of coordinated reaction disintegrates. This is exactly what made the path into the unknown so dangerous. It was not just a geographical transition, but a transition between two military worlds. As long as the legions acted as a united force, their superiority was immense. But as soon as they disintegrated into pieces, they lost part of what made them legions. The weather came to the sight. Rain, damp air, muddy ground. All this not only made progress more difficult, but also increased exhaustion. A heavily loaded soldier, a draft animal, a wagon. Everyone moves differently when the ground gives way, when paths become slippery, when moisture burdens weapons, clothing, and morale. Marching discipline alone can do a lot against natural conditions, but not everything. And the longer such a move lasts, the more the arduous locomotion itself turns into an invisible opponent. Men get tired, distances grow, speed and order come under pressure. No enemy is yet visible, and yet something is already working against the Romans that cannot simply be fought down with bravery. For Arminius' Germanic allies, this march was probably the moment when planning became a certainty. As long as the legions were not deep enough in the terrain, everything remained precarious. Now, however, the men who were taking up positions in secret or standing by could see that the Romans were indeed taking the path they had hoped for. Perhaps a mixture of relief and fear spread among them. Relief because the plan worked. Fear because now the real test began. Because putting an enemy in the right position is one thing. To really destroy him, there is something else. The legions still carried their weapons. They were still numerous, battle-hardened soldiers. The march into the unknown was therefore at the same time a step of the Romans into the trap and a step of the conspirators into their own risk. As for the ordinary legionnaires, they probably lived in a different reality. They did not think in grand strategic contexts, but in the impositions of the day. Weight on the shoulders, wetness in the coat, the sound of the equipment, the worry about position and command, the attention to the person in front, to animals, paths, minor delays. History doesn't feel big to most of its participants at first. It feels like tiredness, waiting, cursing, obedience. This is precisely what makes the Roman tragedy so vivid. These men did not march with the knowledge that they were taking part in one of the darkest turning points in Roman history. They marched into the framework of their duty. The enormity lay not in their expectation, but in the distance between expectation and reality. Varus himself becomes particularly visible in this chapter as a man of certainty. He does not lead an army into an openly known decisive battle, but into an operation that he considers controllable. Perhaps he observes the weather with dissatisfaction. Perhaps he registers the travails of the terrain. Perhaps he hears reports and orders adjustments. But all this is probably happening within an interpretive framework that is not fundamentally shaken. This is precisely what makes him so tragic. He is not the panicked commander who runs blindly into chaos. He is the orderly governor who believes that he can solve an orderly problem by orderly means. And it is precisely this attitude that leads him further and further into a space in which his order will soon no longer be effective. The march, therefore, also has an almost symbolic quality. Rome, the realm of roads, of surveying, of systematic domination, is gradually leaving the realm in which these qualities can unfold their full power. It invades terrain that is narrower, darker, wetter, and harder to read. The deeper the column advances, the stronger the contrast between what is Rome and what Germania represents as a space of resistance. The path itself becomes a transition from imperial self-confidence to the zone of fragility. At the same time, one senses the special cruelty of delay in this chapter. The catastrophe does not come from the sky in one fell swoop. It approaches kilometer by kilometer. Each additional section increases the vulnerability. Every bottleneck makes the Romans more dependent on guidance, luck, and sight. Every drop of rain, every muddy step, every stretch of the column is another silent step away from the Roman ideal form of battle. The trap does not close suddenly, but gradually. Precisely in this lies its perfection. The later the Romans realize that they are not only marching, but already losing, the more difficult any correction becomes. For Arminius, the moment may have come at some point when there was no turning back. Perhaps he left the Roman side under plausible pretexts. Perhaps he used his freedom of movement to make final consultations with the allies. This moment has almost mythical force. The man whom Varus trusts detaches himself from the immediate vicinity of the army and finally steps over to the side of those forces waiting in the shadows. It is the invisible point at which the political deception turns into military reality. From then on, Arminius is no longer the mediator of the Romans. but the executor of a plan that will strike at their core. And yet the tragedy of the march remains to the end in the fact that the Romans can still believe in their ability to act. Maybe they crunch at the weather, maybe they curse the way, maybe a certain restlessness grows. But they are still marching. The enemy has not yet appeared as the full truth. One can still hope to soon put the situation in order, to build camps, to regain an overview. It is precisely this hope that is necessary for the coming blow to have its maximum effect. If the army were already acting in full knowledge of its situation, it would be more dangerous. As it is, however, it carries with it the illusion of an orderly continuation, and it is precisely this illusion that makes it vulnerable. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is no dramatic climax in the usual sense, but a terrible intensification of movement. The army is on its way. The order has not yet been destroyed, but it has already been overstretched. Confidence in the leadership and purpose of the march still exists, but its basis is falsified. The terrain is getting narrower, the weather heavier, the paths more unsafe. Invisibly at the edges of this march, men are waiting who have prepared the moment. In the long column of legions, every step carries weight, every delay carries danger, every further distance a deeper entanglement in what is no longer simply difficult land, but a prepared doomsday. Thus, Chapter 9 shows the real beauty and cruelty of strategic deception. Rome is not marching to ruin because it is weak. Rome is marching to ruin because it is still strong enough to believe in the meaning of its path. Chapter 10. The forest closes. There are places that not only absorb an enemy, but transform him. Places where people can no longer act in the same way as before, because space, weather, and movement themselves become forces that undermine any habitual order. For the Romans, the forest became just such a place in those days. It was no longer just a landscape, not just a difficult section on an uncomfortable march, but something that turned against her step by step. In Chapter 10, space itself begins to take on the role that in other wars often belongs to the opponent alone. Not all weapons have yet been raised. The annihilation has not yet completely broken out. But the forest is already closing, and with it closes a reality around the legions in which their familiar certainties no longer have a firm hold. At first, this change does not manifest itself in a single dramatic moment, but in a chain of small shifts. The path becomes narrower. The ground is getting deeper. The air is damp and heavy, rain lies in the branches or falls again, and every step requires more strength than it would on dry ground. Where previously marching order was possible, men now have to avoid each other, animals hesitate, wagons move more slowly. A path that appears only as a route on a map or in a message becomes a burden in the experience of the army. The column stretches. Distances open up between the units. Commands take longer to reach their recipients. It's not panic yet. It's not yet an open collapse. But the army's ability to move as a closed form is already under attack day by day, hour by hour. For a Roman legion, unity was more than mere physical proximity. It was the core of their military identity. The strength of the legion did not lie solely in the individual soldier, however well trained and disciplined he might be. It lay in the reliability of the whole, in the awareness that one is part of an order that supports and at the same time benefits the individual. Sign next to shield, cohort next to cohort, supported by clear commands, proven procedures, and the knowledge of how to respond to pressure. In open terrain, such an order could develop enormous power even under difficult conditions. But the more the terrain separated men from each other, the more it cut the ranks, the more the collective strength became a reminder of a state that was just being lost. The forest did just that. It deprived the Romans of the vastness in which they could unfold. Between trees, damp hollows, narrow passages, and unclear edges, even a trained army loses its overview. What lies left and right remains uncertain. Line of sight breaks off. A sound seems closer or farther away than it actually is. The front as a clear idea begins to blur. You no longer march through a space that you control, but through a space that welcomes you without being read. For the locals, this was no wonder. They knew the way in which forests swallow distances. confuse sounds, and make safe orientation difficult. For the Romans, however, it meant a creeping alienation. The country did not obey the categories with which they wanted to classify it. In addition, there was the burden of the haggle. A Roman army did not march as a mere battle leader. It carried luggage, tools, supplies, animals, wagons, and all those accompanying forms that ensured its durability. It was precisely this organizational completeness that was a sign of his superiority in many campaigns. But in the forest, the same advantage turned into obstruction. Every car that was stuck in the mud acted like an anchor. Any animal that shied or stumbled delayed the whole migration. Every man who had to help pull was less available as a fighter at the same moment. The orderly self-preservation of the army now created friction where speed and adaptability would have been required. Thus, the forest began to decompose not only the formation, but also the logic of Roman warfare itself. Fatigue also took on a new quality. A march under adverse conditions not only exhausts the muscles, he attacks the spirit. If men have to be constantly careful not to slip, to keep their load in balance, not to lose contact with the unit, and at the same time to pay attention to possible danger, then attention eats away at their strength. The rain penetrates through clothes, the floor splashes up, weapons become heavier in wet hands, leather smells different, breathing becomes more laborious. Small complaints add up. No single circumstance is decisive, but all together create an atmosphere of continued weakening. And precisely because the Romans still have to march and function, they have no opportunity to escape this weakening. They continue to move while the country withdraws their reserves bit by bit. For Varus, a growing unease must have become noticeable in this section of the path, even if he did not fundamentally change his interpretation of the situation. An experienced man could see that the terrain and weather were difficult. He had to realize that the column was becoming longer, more difficult to control, and more vulnerable. Perhaps he ordered adjustments, tried to keep the marching lines closer, better coordinate speed and security, or find suitable places for camps and intermediate stops. But all this happened under conditions that he had not determined. A Roman order can discipline men, but it cannot open the forest. It cannot dry mud. He cannot suddenly turn a narrow lack of overview into an open field. This is precisely where the powerlessness of even ordered power becomes apparent. There are spaces in which orders can only be used to a limited extent against reality. Arminius and his allies must have experienced this moment quite differently. To them, every delay, every stretching of the column, every growing fatigue of the Romans, confirmed that the plan was taking full shape. They did not have to act in a constantly open view. It was enough for them to observe the army, see its weaknesses grow, and wait for the right time. In such terrain, not only weapons fight against each other, but also points in time. If you strike too early, you give your opponent the opportunity to rally. If you wait too long, you may lose the opportunity to create maximum confusion. The forest itself helped them with this decision. The deeper the Romans pushed themselves, the more nature cut through their order, the more the place became an ally of those who knew it. This knowledge of the country was far more than practical knowledge. It was a different way of experiencing space. For the Germanic tribes, the forest was not just an obstacle, but a web of possibilities. Paths did not have to be wide and permanently marked in order to be usable. Mountain ranges, dense rows of trees, damp lowlands, hidden approaches and retreats could be translated intuitively or from experience into military thinking. Where the Romans saw difficulties above all, their opponents saw cover, rapprochement, separation, exhaustion of the enemy. So the forest did not close by chance. It closed because one side experienced it as an obstacle and the other as a weapon. In this phase, the relationship between the visible and the invisible also changes. In the open field, danger is usually concrete. You see banners, lines, movements. In the forest, danger is first and foremost a guess. A noise in the undergrowth. A shadow between trunks. A sudden silence of animals or a call whose origin remains unclear. It is precisely this uncertainty that wears us down. A Roman soldier could be brave, but bravery is more easily directed at a visible opponent than at the suspicion of being observed everywhere. Thus, even before the actual blow occurs, the forest begins to destroy the Romans' idea of a controllable battle situation. They no longer know exactly where the enemy is, how big he is, when he will attack. Everything becomes possible, and that is precisely what paralyzes. Perhaps there were already minor harassments, isolated raids, fired spears or disturbances during this time, which had less the purpose of causing immediate decisive damage than of creating unrest. Such pinpricks would be logical in this context. They would force the Romans to splinter their attention, increase the feeling of invisibility of the opponent, and make it clear that the forest is not empty. Even if the attacks were still limited, they would have had an enormous psychological effect. Because the worst state for a marching army is the one in which it knows that it is threatened, without being able to put the threat into a clear form. For the ordinary soldiers, the path must now have changed for good. What at the beginning seemed like a laborious assignment becomes a situation in which effort and restlessness are combined. Men look to the side more often, hold the grip on the weapon or shield more tightly, turn half around at every sound, try to move forward and remain attentive at the same time. Fatigue makes irritable. Small incidents have a bigger effect. A shy animal, a fallen chariot, a delayed order, everything takes on sharpness. The unit is still marching, but it is no longer marching under the protection of self-evident order. She now moves in the awareness that something is wrong, without already understanding the full extent. It is precisely this intermediate state that is dangerous. He exhausts without giving clarity. Roman camp building, otherwise a means of taming chaos through daily rhythm and discipline, also became more difficult in such terrain. Where can you find enough dry, open space? Where can enclosures be built sensibly if the state itself makes access difficult? Where is there enough order not only to survive at night, but also to remain capable of acting? Every resting place now had to be fought for more strongly, not necessarily against people, but against the conditions. Even if the Romans did set up camps, they were probably camps under pressure, born of exhaustion, wetness, and growing insecurity. Rest on such nights is never real peace. It is a waiting under load. And therein lies the power of this chapter. The forest does not destroy in a single moment. He takes security first, then speed, then overview, then strength, then trust in the usual form of the march. Step by step, a state arises in which the Romans are still the same men, but no longer the same army. They still wear their armor, their weapons, their ranks. But the context that makes all this an almost invincible war machine has already been tarnished. The enemy has not yet completely smashed them, but space has already changed them. For Varus, this is probably the last period in which political error and military hope can still coexist. He may recognize that the situation is becoming unpleasant and dangerous. But perhaps he still hopes to regain control with determination, camp discipline, and achieving more favorable positions. That is the tragic thing about this phase. The hope is not completely absurd. A Roman army was able to hold its own under difficult circumstances. But she needed time, space, and cohesion to do so, precisely those goods that the forest was increasingly depriving her of. In this way, space itself becomes the first great victor over Rome. Even before the main force of the ambush breaks loose, forest, rain, mud, and narrowness have already fulfilled what every clever opponent had to wish for. They slowed down, stretched, tired, and mentally insecure the army. The Romans are still moving forward, but they no longer carry with them the whole self-evident nature of their strength. Trees stand around them like walls of an alien order. Under their feet the ground works against every step, and in the humid air there is the feeling that one is no longer moving through a country, but is being trapped in it. The forest does not close with a bang. It closes by making every way out a little more difficult, every movement a little more expensive, every certainty a little weaker. And when an army finally understands this, it is often already too late. Chapter 11. The First Strike. Every great catastrophe has a moment in which the hidden becomes visible. A moment in which hunch becomes certainty, restlessness becomes panic, and the quiet work of deception turns into open violence. For the Romans in the Teutoburg Forest, this moment did not begin with the thunder of an orderly field battle, not with marching armies facing each other in the open air. It began suddenly, fragmented, from a direction that did not show a clear front. The first blow was therefore not only the beginning of the fight. It was the moment when the whole Roman reality of the past days collapsed. Everything that had been interpreted as a laborious march, as an unclear danger, as an unpleasant but manageable situation, now showed its true face. The legions were not on their way to a disturbance. They were already trapped. The attack probably did not come as a single massive onslaught, but as a series of sudden, hard-to-locate blows. Spears from the forest. Men who broke out of cover and disappeared just as quickly. Screams that seemed to come from several directions at once. Perhaps it hit the edges of the column first, those parts that had become particularly vulnerable due to the difficult terrain. Perhaps the entourage and rearguard were the first to be besieged, perhaps individual units that were already separated from each other by mud, trees, and wagons. It was not the first loss itself that was decisive, but the effect that this beginning had on it. It destroyed the last hope for an orderly, manageable situation. For a Roman soldier, open combat was not the worst thing. The worst thing was the struggle without form. Legionnaires were trained to stand in ranks, receive orders, close shields, react to signals, and assert themselves in a coordinated manner. The first blow in the forest, however, was directed precisely against this way of fighting. It didn't just hit bodies, but structures. Men could not immediately see where the focus of the attack was. Officers had to understand in seconds whether it was a limited harassment or the beginning of a full-scale raid. The unit that was marching just a moment ago may have had to stop, protect, form, and keep its bearings at the same time. All under conditions in which visibility and space made it difficult to order quickly. The shock of this moment can hardly be overestimated. Anyone who has been walking in a strenuous but familiar logic of the march until just now will be torn apart by the sudden attack. Fatigue abruptly turns into alarm. Thoughts jump from the burden on the shoulders to the question of where the enemy is. Animals react in panic. Wagons block paths. Shouts overlap. Men look for their positions. A single javelin throw can cause more confusion in such a situation than a whole hail of projectiles in open battle. Not because it is militarily stronger, but because it strikes into an already tense system. And that's exactly what the Germanic tribes did. They did not wait for Rome to face the fight in ideal form. They let the fight break into an army that did not exist in an ideal form. Perhaps the first thing many Romans felt was not even fear in the full sense, but incredulity. This brief inner faltering when reality does not immediately correspond to what you have just assumed. A governor like Varus could expect unrest, difficulties, local hostilities. But now it became clear that the hostility was not local, not accidental, not limited. She was prepared. It was coordinated. And she knew the terrain better than the men who now had to face her. It was precisely at this moment that the Roman defeat began to become deeper than mere losses. For the Romans now lost not only men, but also the interpretation of the situation. If you don't understand what kind of struggle you're in, you're reacting too late or wrong. Arminius's plan here unfolded its full cruelty. The first blow was not just there to cause damage. It was to bring about a state in which the Romans could no longer distinguish between march and battle. As long as an army is marching, different rules apply than in orderly combat. Luggage, order, belaying, resting, movement, everything is designed to move forward. If this system is suddenly thwarted by attack from all sides, then the army must switch to another mode. But it is precisely this change that needs space, time, overview, and leadership. And all this was insufficiently available in the forest. So the enemy did not simply strike at an army. He struck at her transition, at the most vulnerable moment between movement and defense. Imagine the background noise. Wet ground under fast steps. The dull hammering of spears into wood, leather, or meat. Screams of the wounded. the snorting and tearing of draft animals. Commands that are lost in the noise or are only half understood. The cracking of branches, the metallic sound of weapons being hastily drawn. In an open battle, even noise often has a recognizable structure. Here, however, the sound itself must have become part of the confusion. You hear danger without seeing it precisely. The undergrowth reflects sounds. An attack on the right makes heads go there, while the next push follows on the left. It is precisely this acoustic fragmentation that intensifies the powerlessness. The enemy is there, but he cannot be caught as in the world of Roman order. For the Germanic warriors, on the other hand, this was the moment when long-suppressed energy was released. Weeks, perhaps months, of secrecy, waiting and inner tension were now unleashed. But even for her, the first blow was not a simple rage of blind rage. It was part of a precise logic. Don't stand still. Don't let the Romans fight where they could find their order again. Pushing, backing away, resurfacing, pushing from different directions, tearing the train, using fear and fatigue. The forest, the weather and the dispersed column provided the framework. Now people had to make a fight out of it. It may be assumed that the Germanic warriors themselves were in the highest agitation. But her arousal at that moment was working with the terrain, not against it. Varus and his officers had to react quickly. A Roman commander could not stand idly by while order fell apart. Attempts were probably made to pull units together, close shields, gain space, secure the entourage, or at least release them from its paralyzing effect. Perhaps an attempt was made to stabilize particularly threatened sections or to move back to more favorable terrain. But each of these measures encountered the same basic difficulty. The enemy did not fight according to the rules for which the Roman army was prepared. He was not looking for a clear decision in a united line, but for the continued dissolution of cohesion. In this way, even sensible commands were limited in their effect. What was needed for order, namely an overview and free room for maneuver, was already damaged before it could be used. For the ordinary soldiers, this first blow was probably the end of any inner distance from danger. Until now, they had marched with difficulty and perhaps felt that something was wrong. Now there was no longer any ambiguity. They died. Men next to you collapsed. Blood mixed with rain and mud. A spear hit where there had been nothing but forest just a moment ago. The enemy was no longer a possibility, but a reality that sprang out of space itself. This is precisely why the first attack was particularly cruel. It hit the individual soldier's idea of protection. What was gone a moment ago became the place of death. What was just a landscape became the source of the attack. This not only corrodes courage, but also the foundations of trust in the environment. The greatest strength of the Romans, their discipline, was perhaps shown precisely in the fact that they did not immediately fall apart completely. Legionnaires could also fight under shock. They could raise shields, ignore wounds, search for officers, respond to commands, withdraw the wounded, strike back hard against individual attacks. That is precisely why the first blow was not the annihilation itself. He was the opening of the wound. The Romans were still dangerous as soon as they took even fragmentary form anywhere, and the Germanic tribes knew that. Therefore, the pressure was not allowed to turn into an open, even struggle. The attack was bound to keep the army motionless, tired, and obscure. It is possible that some Roman units tried to make smaller counterattacks to keep the enemy away from the edges. Perhaps there were heroic individual moments in which centurions gathered their men, in which cohorts briefly asserted themselves, in which Germanic attackers had to retreat if they encountered steel and discipline too directly. Such scenes fit the nature of Roman fighting power, but it was precisely their local bravery that could not stop the overall process. Because it wasn't about a point where you had to stand firm. It was about an army that was attacked along its entire length, under the most adverse conditions and without a clear front. Heroism in one place could not prevent disintegration in another. The panic, therefore, probably did not occur everywhere at the same time. This is important to understand. In retrospect, Major military disasters often seem like a single collapse. In reality, they arise from many different states that coexist. Here, a unit still sticks together. There the entourage breaks apart. Here, men fight doggedly for a piece of the way. There, animals run through the rows. Here, an officer tries to enforce orders. There, the command bearers are already dead or cut off. It is precisely this inconsistency that makes the first strike so devastating. It does not affect the army as a compact mass, but as a long, differently burdened reality. Each section reacts differently, and it is precisely because of this that the overall context becomes increasingly difficult to establish. At this moment, it also becomes apparent how completely Arminius had used the Roman way of thinking against them. Varus had not been led into a classic battle that he could lose or win. He had been led into a situation in which the categories of victory and orderly defeat no longer applied at first. You couldn't set up a clear enemy. It was not possible to force an ideal battle line. You couldn't just choose the space in which you played out your superiority. The first strike thus not only made vulnerability visible. He destroyed the possibility of waging the battle according to Roman concepts. For the Germanic tribes, this was also a psychological triumph. Not because the victory was already certain, but because the first breakthrough in the perception of the opponent had been achieved. The Romans were surprised. They were out of balance. The empire, which was considered the epitome of order, fell into a state in which the forest, the rain, and the confusion swallowed up his orders. In such moments, the attacker also gains strength. Anyone who senses that the seemingly overpowering enemy is faltering fights differently. Courage grows. The long wait is right. The secret of the alliance becomes a visible effect. The first blow was therefore also proof for the Germanic tribes that Rome could not only be challenged, but really hit. And yet there was still no final decision about all this. The first blood had flowed. The first attacks had worked. The Roman column was shaken. But an army of this size does not die in minutes. It fights, contracts, looks for ways out, perhaps builds makeshift defenses, carries the wounded, falls back, hopes for night, for camp, for better ground, for a moment of recollection. This is precisely the terrible dynamic after the first blow. Both sides now know that the big fight has begun, but no one is immediately finished. The first attack is the opening of the abyss, not the fall to the bottom. Thus, chapter 11 does not end with complete annihilation, but with the collapse of an illusion. The Romans understood that they were not marching through Germania in an orderly manner, but were to be dismantled by a prepared enemy in the most unfavorable space imaginable. The Germanic tribes have understood that their plan actually strikes meat, kills men, and makes the enemy falter. The forest, which had previously brought narrowness, wetness, and insecurity, has now finally become war. Every tree can be cover, every shadow the starting point of a new push, every step deeper into it a further loss of control. The first strike is therefore more than a military beginning. It is the moment when Rome ceases to understand itself in Germania. Chapter 12. 3 Days of Hell. When an army is defeated in open battle, it often happens in a clear sequence. Lines break, wings give way, a decision is made, and the fate of the day becomes visible. But what the Romans experienced in the Teutoburg Forest was not a defeat of this kind. It was a slow, agonizing grinding over several days, a struggle without liberating clarity, without the one moment when everything would have been decided and thus in a certain way closed. This is precisely what made this catastrophe so terrible. It did not come like a stroke of the sword, but like a continuous suffocation. Chapter 12 tells of those days when the first blow turned into a state of total exhaustion, despair, and gradual shattering. After the first attack, the Romans did not simply find themselves in a single chaotic flight. That's important. An army like that of Varus did not immediately break up into complete dissolution. It continued to fight, tried to organize itself, sought protection, formed makeshift defenses, and still hoped to regain a remnant of control through discipline, camp building, retreat, or reaching more favorable ground. It was precisely this ability to persevere that prolonged the suffering, because it did not turn the defeat into a quick collapse, but a struggle for survival lasting several days. Every hour brought new losses, new exhaustion, and new insight into the increasingly worse situation. The first day probably didn't end with silence, but with a kind of tortured breathing. The Romans must have tried to gather somewhere, to set up a camp or at least a defensible position, to bring the wounded together, to find officers, to reorganize units, and to secure or relieve the entourage as far as possible. That was very Roman. Even in the worst chaos, camp construction was not just routine, but an act of self-assertion against dissolution. A confined space, shelters, orderly guards, a makeshift structure, all this could give an army the feeling that it was not yet completely lost. But under the conditions of the forest, the wetness and the constant threat, even this attempt was already marked by desperation. You have to imagine the night. Rain or damp cold. Injured people whose wounds are being provisionally cared for, while there is a shortage everywhere. Men who hardly know where their comrades have gone. Horses that snort restlessly. Shouts, orders, maybe crying, cursing, moaning. The ground is wet, sleep is hardly possible, the nerves are overstimulated. And above all, the certainty that the enemy is not encamped far away on an orderly battlefield, but all around in a space that belongs to him. A Roman camp usually also lives from the psychological effect of its fixed order. Here, however, even the makeshift camp for the night had to act like a meager rampart against an overwhelming uncertainty. It may offer protection, but hardly any comfort. The next morning, the fight began not as a new, clearly demarcated day, but as a continuation of a state of affairs that no one could quite control. The Romans had to move on. Standing still was dangerous, supplies and ability to act shrank, wounded put additional strain on the column, and the hope was probably directed towards breaking out of the unfavorable terrain or reaching a room in which one could form better. But every marching step of the second day was now more difficult than on the first. The men were exhausted, many injured, order damaged, confidence in leadership and situation shaken. The arduous march of the previous day had now become a march under the weight of defeat. This was precisely the genius of Germanic tactics. They forced the Romans to drag their weakness with them. Every night did not give the army real respite, but only respite. Each new day began with less strength, less overview, less hope. The Germanic tribes did not have to look for a classic decisive battle. It was enough to keep up the pressure, to keep the Romans moving, to disrupt their formation again and again, to prevent their attempts at gathering and to take advantage of every advantage of the terrain. Where the Romans formed a line, attackers could evade. Where they marched, they could be crushed again. Where they set up a camp, the fear of being vulnerable again remained when they set off or at night. In this way, time itself became a weapon. For the Germanic warriors, these days must have been a roller coaster of battle frenzy, tension, and brutal endurance. They, too, did not fight with ease. The terrain was hard, the weather stressful, the danger real. Competing against Roman soldiers in hand-to-hand combat remained risky. Even in weakened form, legionnaires were armed, battle-hardened men who could answer any careless attack with death. So the Germanic tribes had to use their superiority wisely. They couldn't just run blindly. They had to attack, break away, start again, let the terrain speak, and never give the Romans the space to effectively develop their full discipline. This also required nerves, courage, and leadership. Perhaps it is precisely here that the real greatness of the secret alliance becomes apparent. Not only had it trapped the enemy, but it was now able to keep up the pressure for days. That was no small achievement. Tribal warriors who came from different groups had to coordinate their approach, at least in principle, recognize the right moment for attacks, and not let themselves be driven into unfavorable hand-to-hand combat too early by the previous success. It was no longer just about being brave. It was a matter of remaining patiently cruel. The enemy must not be given the chance to reverse the whole relationship by a single successful breakout. Meanwhile, the Romans experienced the progressive disintegration of their military world. The legion is an institution that lives from the belief in coherence. A man knows where his place is, who he obeys, who is fighting next to him, how the units relate to each other. In the 3 days of the forest fight, it is precisely this connection that must have been ground down piece by piece. Officers fell. Standards were lost or had to be protected with difficulty. Cohorts were cut off from each other. Men no longer fought as part of a fully recognizable order, but often only as remnants of their original belonging. And yet many probably held on to it precisely because it was the last thing they had left of their identity. A Roman who was still standing shield to shield with a few others in such a situation was defending not only his life, but the idea that he was still part of a legion. The second day must therefore have been particularly cruel. The first one had surprised. The second instructed. Now it was clear to everyone that it was not a misunderstanding, not a temporary disturbance, not a localized attack. It was a systematic attempt to destroy the army. The men had to fight with the knowledge that it was not just a matter of holding out until the next command, but perhaps of the bare survival of an army whose way out was becoming increasingly uncertain. In such moments, the psychological burden grows immeasurably. Tiredness alone can be endured. Fear alone too. But tiredness, fear, wetness, hunger, pain, and the awareness of the dwindling sense of the whole, that tugs at everything. In addition, there was the burden of the wounded. An orderly army does not try to leave its injured frivolously. But in a state of constant threat, any care becomes a dilemma. He who carries a wounded man fights worse. Those who leave it behind lose humanity and morality. The Romans must have been faced with such decisions again and again. Some comrades could be taken away, others not. Perhaps voices from the forest could be heard for a long time, shouts, pleas, screams that could no longer be answered. Such experiences destroy a troop not only physically, but also internally, because they make it clear that even the camaraderie on which one trusts comes up against limits that space and violence enforce. Food, drought, and usable equipment now also became a problem. Wet bows are less good, tendons suffer, leather softens, metal does not rust immediately but feels different, clothes become heavy, supplies spoil faster or are difficult to reach. Men don't fight in the abstract, but with things that have to be intact. In a nightmare like this that lasts several days, even the everyday becomes part of the downfall. Those who freeze are slower. If you can't eat, you become weaker. Those who hardly sleep react later. Thus the great historical drama is composed of 1,000 small humiliations of the body. At some point in the course of these days, the hope of salvation must have increasingly turned into mere will to survive. Perhaps some officers still believed that they could force an escape. Perhaps they clung to the achievement of better terrain. Perhaps there were brief moments when an orderly defense or a fierce counterbattle gave the impression that the Romans could still hold their own. Such moments are important in disasters because they prolong suffering. As long as there is still hope of tactical rescue, the fighting continues. Only much later does this hope turn into the more bitter realization that one is no longer struggling for victory, but only for the nature of the downfall. The third day probably brought exactly this realization to the surface. By this time, the legions must have been not only weakened, but already deeply damaged. Men were missing. Officers were dead or separated from each other. Equipment was lost, morale exhausted, the entourage torn, mobility severely restricted. The Germans, on the other hand, now had the great advantage that they no longer relied only on surprise, but on the advanced decay of the opponent. Each new attack encountered less toughness. Every delay had a more devastating effect. And every attempt by the Romans to rally had to run up against a reality that had already solidified against them. It is possible that the battle intensified particularly in this last section, because the Romans came to a bottleneck, a rampart, a slope, or another part of the terrain where their situation became completely hopeless. Historically, there are many indications that the terrain played a decisive role and forced the last resistance into a space from which there was hardly any escape. Dramaturgically, this is of great power. After days of continuous attrition, in which the forest, the weather and the attacks have hollowed out the army, the moment comes when the remaining Roman strength clashes against a final condensed resistance. The focus is no longer on the vastness of the marching column, but on the narrow space in which everything converges: tiredness, despair, courage, death. Scenes of shocking intensity must have taken place there. Centurions who call men together with ultimate authority. Wounded who nevertheless stand still because fleeing is pointless. Officers who see that orders no longer have a future and are still given. Germanic warriors whose determination now becomes almost unstoppable because they sense that the enemy is finally breaking. Perhaps assaults on improvised defenses, perhaps battles over remnants of ramparts, over wagons, over corpses. The third day was no longer just war. He was the dissolution of a world. The world of Roman certainty that every crisis could be controlled in the end through discipline, and order died here in the mud between trees and hastily erected obstacles. And yet one should not forget that even in this situation, Roman bravery must have been real. Precisely because everything was lost, individual steadfastness and soldierly duty were perhaps all the more visible. Men continued to fight even though they had no chance of winning. Not out of blind mechanism alone, but because honor, training, camaraderie, and sheer defiance held them. This does not make the downfall smaller, but bigger. It was not the case of a cowardly or completely incompetent army. It was the smashing of a strong army under conditions that turned its strength into fetters. For the Germanic tribes, these 3 days meant more than just military success. They were proof that Rome could not only be ambushed, but wounded in its depths. An empire that considered itself the bearer of order now became itself a picture of chaos, fatigue, and bloody powerlessness. The psychological change must have been enormous. What seemed almost invincible for generations could die, scream, flee, collapse. This experience shapes people. It changes not only power relations, but also ideas of what is possible at all. At the end of the third day, there was scarcely the orderly force left of Varus' martial army that had once broken out. What remained were scattered remains, last pockets of resistance, wounded, dead, lost standards, destroyed wagons, blood-soaked ground, and the terrible certainty that 3 legions had perished in the forest. Not in a glorious decisive battle, but in a nightmare of rain, mud, confinement, and relentless attack. That is why this chapter bears its name rightly. It wasn't just 3 days of fighting. It was 3 days in which Roman power gradually turned into despair. 3 days in which the forest, the people and fate together created a hell from which hardly anyone escaped alive. Chapter 13, The Fall of Varus. At the end of every great defeat there is not only the image of destroyed ranks, fallen men and lost banners, but also the moment when a commander realizes that history is slipping away from him. For Publius Quinctilius Varus, this moment did not come in the quiet of a tent, not after a deliberate deliberation, and not under conditions that would have left a Roman governor the dignity of a regulated decision. He came in the mud, under the pressure of continued attacks, surrounded by exhaustion, wounded, scattered remnants of his army, and the collapse of all that he had believed in as a representative of Rome. Chapter 13 is therefore more than the description of a death. It is the chapter in which the entire failure of Roman certainty is condensed in a single man. The case of Varus is not only personally tragic, it is symbolic. In it, Rome itself falls, not as a world power, but as an unshakable image of its own superiority. After 3 days of grinding, Varus was probably no longer the man who wanted to establish order in Germania at the beginning of the march. He had seen how his legions were cut up, how their discipline against terrain, weather, and deception lost its effect, how officers fell, how the entourage became a burden, how military control arose into an ever more desperate improvisation. A man of his rank, his experience, and his self-image had to understand that this was not just an unfortunate incident. Here was a complete defeat in the making, a defeat of a kind that could no longer be corrected by severity, obedience, or administrative determination. The point at which a Roman governor realizes that he no longer rules, but is driven, must have been one of the most bitter moments of his life. Perhaps Varus had tried for a long time to put the rest of the events into those categories that had carried all his thinking. The men are gathered. They are looking for favorable terrain. You keep the shape. One sets the will against the adverse circumstances. This is exactly how a Roman leadership thinks as long as there is still any hope of action. But especially in the last hours of this catastrophe, the truth must have become increasingly clear. There was no longer an orderly way out. The enemy could not be caught, the space could not be controlled, the troops could no longer be brought back to their full order. The downfall did not come as a sudden surprise, but as a growing, inexorable realization. And maybe that was the worst. Not to lose in a single shock, but to be forced to recognize one's own failure step by step. A man like Varus bore not only the burden of his life, but also the burden of his office. In Rome, he was not simply a private person. He was governor, senator, representative of the emperor, bearer of the dignity of the empire. His failure was never just his own. 3 legions were under his command. Her case would remain associated with his name. He must have known that. A Roman aristocrat did not live alone for the moment. He lived in the horizon of honor, reputation, aftermath, and the question of how later generations would pronounce his name. This is precisely the tragedy of his end. Death threatened him not only physically. He was also threatened by the idea of a life ending in disgrace, perhaps in captivity, perhaps in public humiliation, perhaps as a plaything of those he had underestimated. In the Roman world, therefore, the idea of an honorable death was by no means a mere pose. For many men in the ruling class, he was part of an ethos that linked defeat and shame more closely than modern ideas often do. Better to die than to live in shame. This idea was not romantic, but deeply rooted socially and politically. Especially for a commander who knew that his army had been destroyed, his mission had failed, and his person had been broken as a sign of Roman authority. Surrendering himself alive to the enemy would not only have meant his own end, it would have further violated the idea of Roman dignity. In this logic lies the step that Varus took in the end, not flight in hope, but flight into death. But before this last step is taken, it is worth looking at the inner path to get there. What does a man think at such a moment? Is he thinking of Rome? Of Augustus? Of former offices? Of his family? Of the path that led him here? Does he think of warnings that he did not take seriously enough? Of Arminius, whose trust he believed to be genuine? Officers who are now dead or scattered? Perhaps in such situations the mind is not as ordered as later stories suggest. Perhaps clarity and dull shock alternate with each other. Maybe the thought doesn't come as a long reflection, but as a sudden hard knowledge. It's over. The army is lost. I'm lost. And what remains now is only the question of the form of the end. It is precisely the betrayal of Arminius that must have possessed a special sharpness in the last perception of Varus, even if not every thought could be formulated in the heat of the downfall. An enemy in the forest is terrible. An enemy that you have trusted is something deeper. For it destroys not only military security, but also the interpretation of the whole of reality. Varus not only lost one battle. He had to realize that he had been wrong at the core in his assessment of the country, people, and power. Arminius had not been the mediator of Roman rule, but its gravedigger. This insight hits a man's pride harder than any spear. Because she says, you weren't just beaten. You were understood and used. This is what makes his case so historically significant. In Varus, it was not just a governor who died. A certain Roman relationship to Germania died. The conviction that it has already been pacified far enough to be able to administer it. The assumption that local elites can be permanently integrated, as elsewhere. The self-confidence with which the administration and military presence intertwined. All this was with Varus in the forest. And all that collapsed with him. In his death, therefore, lies the condensed truth of the whole defeat. Not a single tactical mistake alone, but the failure of an imperial perception of reality. Nevertheless, one must not make the mistake of seeing Varus only as a cold symbol. Just in his last moment, he becomes fully human again. A vulnerable body, tired, perhaps injured, surrounded by men who are also at the limit of their strength. Roman armor no longer protects the feeling of superiority. She herself has become heavy, wet, burdensome, part of a dying body. The face, which used to bear official calm, must now have been marked by dirt, exertion, and the harshness of the last hours. In such moments, titles do not fall away from the outside, but they shrink before the immediacy of dying. Varus is then no longer just a governor. He is a man who must decide whether he can keep the last bit of control over his fate. His closest companions will also have played a role. Men around him, officers or personal companions who saw how hopeless the situation was. Perhaps some died at his side. Perhaps others advised flight, last resistance, or the very step he finally took. Such constellations are often characterized by unspoken clarity. No one has to say for a long time what reality already dictates. When the commander can no longer save what was entrusted to him, and when captivity is considered a disgrace, then death becomes the last form of decision. Not because it is victory, but because it deprives the opponent of complete humiliation of triumph. Roman tradition therefore associates Varus' end with a motif of suicide. Wounded, desperate, or convinced of the hopelessness of the situation, he is said to have killed himself in order not to fall alive into the hands of the enemy. This decision has an almost unbearable logic in the dramatic truth of the material. It is not heroic pathos in the cheap sense. It is the dark end of a man who has lost everything that made him a Roman governor: his army, his order, his authority, his mission, and the future of his name. Is there anything left but the choice of the last moment? And yet there is not only dignity in this step, but also bitter powerlessness. Because even the self-chosen death does not save Varus from history. It takes away his imprisonment, but not his failure. It withdraws it from immediate humiliation, but not from the memory of its downfall. His name will survive in Rome not as the name of the brave victor, but as the name of the catastrophe. Maybe that's what makes the scene so harrowing. Death, which in the Roman imagination was supposed to preserve a remnant of honor, can no longer conceal the magnitude of the disaster here. He only marks them definitively. For the men around him, this moment must have been devastating as well. When a commander falls, it's not just a body that falls. A final point of reference falls. Even if the military situation was almost hopeless, the death of the commander-in-chief is a moral and symbolic shock. Some may have lost the last remnant of resistance as a result. Others may have continued to fight with desperate defiance precisely because of this. But in any case, the quality of the downfall changes. As long as Varus lived, there was still a center, a name, an instance. With his death, even this last center disintegrates. Defeat turns into final collapse. For the Germanic tribes, the fall of Varus had its own significance. Not only because a central enemy was dead, but because his death marked the completion of the plan. The man who embodied Rome in Germania had fallen. That was more than a tactical success. It was an act of deep symbolic conversion. The empire, which saw itself as the bearer of history, did not lose its governor in a distant provincial uprising, but in a space that it believed it controlled. And the fact that this man, even imprisoned, could not serve as a living sign of Roman impotence, but withdrew himself from life, perhaps reinforced the image of complete Roman defeat. The enemy had chosen death rather than bear the consequences of his failure. But even from a Germanic point of view, one should not interpret the moment too simply as triumphant pathos. Anyone who fights, kills, and even faces death for days does not experience the fall of the opponent only as jubilation. There is blood, exhaustion, hatred, perhaps amazement that it has really succeeded, perhaps also the raw sobriety of the warrior, who must continue to move forward as long as resistance still exists. The death of Varus does not immediately end the fight, but it marks the point at which the possible victory has become an irrevocable one. After that, there is no return for Rome in this campaign, no salvation by a final gathering, no restoration of Roman order under the same command. The head has fallen. The body will follow. Historically, Varus's end was later remembered so strongly because it combined something deeply Roman and at the same time something profoundly anti-Roman. Roman was the idea of avoiding shame through self-chosen death. Anti-Roman in the historical result was that a representative of the empire thus admitted that his world no longer had any victory, no control and no political answer at that moment. The forest had not only conquered him militarily, he had brought him to the point where the highest form of aristocratic self-assertion was only to no longer live. Thus, at the end of this chapter, Varus stands like a tragic figure from a dark drama. Not a demon, not a pure fool, not a mere bureaucrat, but a man who took his world seriously and for that very reason was destroyed by a reality that he recognized too late. His death is not beautiful, not pure, not glamorous. It happens in defeat, dirt and despair. And that's exactly why he seems so strong. For it shows that great empires do not only fall in political decisions, but in moments when individual people collapse under the weight of these decisions. With the fall of Varus, more than a life ends. It ends the last illusion that Rome could still lead this campaign back to some form of order. The man who had set out to secure dominion chooses death in the forest, because he has nothing left over which he can still rule. Chapter 14, After the Blood Rain. After the noise of the weapons had died down, another kind of silence began. Not a peaceful one, not a redemptive one, not one that would have really ended a war. It was the silence after a devastation in which what had happened still hung in the air, in the ground, in the smell of the rain, in the sight of the dead and in the faces of the survivors. Chapter 14 begins where many war narratives end, after defeat, after triumph, after the moment of decision. But it is often only here that the deepest impact of a historical event becomes apparent. Because a battle is not just the moment when people die. It is also what remains of it, in bodies, in memories, in political order, and in that invisible afterlife that a single catastrophe can unfold through entire generations. For the Germans, the first impression after the victory must have been overwhelming. 3 Roman legions had not only been repulsed, not only dispersed, but destroyed. Men who had set out with the certainty of an empire now lay dead in the mud, among overturned wagons, broken weapons, scattered shields, dead animals, and destroyed luggage. The standards of the enemy, those visible signs of Roman power, had fallen. Officers and ordinary soldiers, commanders and retinues, all had been abandoned to the same end. Anyone who walked through the devastated terrain in those days must have sensed that something had happened that went far beyond an ordinary victory. Rome had not simply been repelled. It had been hit in his self-image. But triumph in such a form is never pure. Among the dead of the enemy there were certainly also their own fallen. Between the pride of victory stood the exhaustion of men who had fought for days, killed, seen blood, and experienced nearness to death themselves. A victory against Rome was not a pageant in the orderly sense. It was an outcry, a fright at one's own deed, a sudden expansion of what was possible. Many Germanic warriors had to grasp for the first time in all their sharpness that the empire that had seemed unshakable to them for so long was truly mortal. The Romans could scream, flee, lie wounded in the mud, lose their standards, and end up as nameless bodies in the forest. There was something liberating about this realization, and at the same time something tremendous. Because whoever destroys such a powerful opponent not only changes the external situation, he also changes the inner horizon of what he thinks is possible for himself. For many tribes of Germania, the battle must have acted as a crack in the previous worldview. Rome had previously been a constant presence of strength, order, intimidation, and seemingly infinite reserve. Now it had become clear that this strength had limits, not somewhere in the stories, but in one's own country, under one's own hands, in the forest that one knew oneself. It was precisely this that gave the victory its deep political significance. It was not just about dead legionnaires, but about a new idea of agency. And yet this moment was dangerous. Because what follows after a great victory is never just freedom. Emptiness, uncertainty, the question of what follows. A common enemy can unite groups. But what happens when he is defeated? Will alliances hold then? Will rivalries return? Will the victory be the beginning of lasting order, or just a great flickering hour after which the old mistrust will be reawakened? It was precisely these questions that had to be answered now, even if they were not immediately spoken out loud. The secret alliance had served its purpose, but an alliance born of necessity remains vulnerable even after victory. It is precisely in this transition between triumph and future that lies one of the most exciting tensions of this chapter. Arminius had to see this more clearly than many others. For him, the victory was not simply completion, but the beginning of a new problem. As long as Rome was still being destroyed in the forest, the logic had been clear: deceive, merge, beat. Now, however, the question arose as to how the victory was to become political reality. Arminius was not only the man of ambush, but now the man on whom hopes, fears, and claims to power had to accumulate. This is the hidden tragedy of a liberator. The moment of greatest triumph is often also the moment when the difficulties of the future begin. For the power to trap an empire is not the same as the power to permanently unite a fragmented world. For the time being, however, something else probably prevailed: the raw, almost incomprehensible extent of the victory. The Germanic tribes were able to take weapons, equipment, and booty. They could literally pick up signs of Roman arrogance from the ground. They could look at the battlefield as if it were a place where history itself had changed direction. Such moments nourish legends almost by themselves. Even before the wounds heal, the memory begins to form. Who was there? Who hit the first important blow? Who saw Varus fall? Who captured a special sign of the Romans? In this way, the reality of the struggle quickly gives rise to a second reality in which deeds are retold, enlarged, ordered, and charged with meaning. For the Romans, on the other hand, the after was of a completely different kind. Most of those who had fallen in the forest could no longer feel anything. But a few escaped, were abducted, or dragged themselves out of the realm of extermination in some form. And for them, the afterlife of the battle began as a trauma. A survivor of such a catastrophe carries memories not only of battle, but of the collapse of all familiar order. Those who escaped from the remnants of the army had to carry images with them that could never be completely shaken off. Standards in the mud, officers dead, comrades cut up, despair on their faces, the feeling that even Roman discipline could no longer compete with reality. Such men did not simply bring news. They brought a shock. And this shaking would reach Rome. One has to imagine what effect the news of the destruction of 3 legions must have had on the empire. In Rome they were accustomed to victories, to arduous campaigns, to insurrections, to setbacks. But such a catastrophe in Germania hit the self-image of power. This was not just any distant auxiliary troop that had been attacked. Legions under the command of a governor had been wiped out here. From then on, the name Varus would no longer be associated with administration, experience, or imperial authority, but with downfall. And the places on the other side of the Rhine, which had been increasingly treated as controllable, suddenly became spaces of horror again. A border region in the making had become a wound in the imperial consciousness. For Augustus and the political leadership, this meant not only a military loss, but a crisis of imagination. Had Germania been treated too early as almost pacified? Had the involvement of local elites been overestimated? Had trust in Roman administrative logic itself become a problem? Such questions were bound to arise, even if they were not openly posed in philosophical form. Because an empire learns from defeats not only tactically, but symbolically. The forest now became the antithesis of Roman order, a place where it had become clear that not every space could simply be transformed into a province. This is precisely the historical depth of this chapter. The blood rain does not end with the last spear. It continues to fall into people's heads. In Germania as pride, as memory, as possibility. In Rome as shame, as a warning, as hardening. Some remember freedom, the others invulnerability. And from these different memories, new decisions arise. Rome will not simply forget its power. It will want to fight back, take revenge, not let the disgrace stand. But at the same time, the attitude towards the region will change. Germania is no longer just a difficult space. It has become a space that can cause political and psychological costs of particular severity. On the battlefield itself, however, a much more primitive truth prevailed at first. The dead lay unburied or only provisionally treated. Bodies decompose quickly, especially in damp weather. The smell of death settles, animals find the fallen, things lose their military order and become mere matter again: wood, leather, metal, flesh. Anyone who saw the battlefield in the days that followed did not see history in the abstract sense, but a landscape that had been reshaped by violence. This is precisely where there is a bitter truth about every great historical turning point. It always leaves behind dirt, corpses, wounds, physical humiliation. The myth comes later. First comes rot. For the people of the region, this site must have been of additional religious and symbolic significance. A place where so many died does not remain neutral. It is loaded with memory, with fear, with narrative. The forest itself changes its meaning as a result. It is no longer just a home, shelter, or combat zone. It is now also a place of events, where Romans fell and Germanic freedom was written in blood. Such places live on, not only in the ground, but in the collective consciousness. Anyone who talks about there later never tells only one geographical area. He tells the story of a place where history changed course. And what became of Thusnelda, of suggests, of those characters who carried the personal into the political conflict in the previous chapters? While this chapter looks more closely at the consequences on a larger scale, it is clear that the victory continued to have an impact on families and relationships. A success of Arminius would have to increase his position enormously. For those who had relied on Rome or had advocated a more cautious policy, it became a challenge. Men like suggests could no longer pretend that the path of resistance was merely foolish or hopeless. The victory gave Arminius not only fame, but also political sharpness. At the same time, this had to increase rather than dissolve the internal tensions in Germania. For the greater the victor, the greater the number of those who fear him or envy him the rank he has won. This makes the victory ambiguous. On the outside it is glamorous, on the inside full of future conflicts. This is precisely what is historically plausible and narratively strong. The battle does not resolve all contradictions, but only changes its form. Rome is defeated, but not gone. Arminius is triumphant, but precisely because of this he is politically exposed. The tribes have been united, but unity in war does not guarantee unity in peace. Chapter 14 must therefore hold this suspense, take the triumph seriously without turning it into false finality. For Rome, on the other hand, the battle goes beyond the purely military to a memory of borders. Empires often believe that every defeat can be corrected, every disgrace can be cleared, and that every enemy is ultimately another building block of future order. And indeed, Rome would later advance again into the area on the other side of the Rhine, lead punitive expeditions, and show its military strength once again. But the Teutoburg catastrophe nevertheless remains a turning point, because it reveals something that cannot simply be reconquered. It shows that rule depends not only on strength, but also on the fit between the form of power and space. Germania was not merely an unfinished Gaul. It was a separate context of resistance, which Rome could not easily squeeze into its usual provincial logic. So there is a strange light over this chapter. It is not the glaring light of victory, nor the pure darkness of mourning. It is the dull, restless light of an after, in which everything is still open and yet nothing will be the same as before. The Germans are looking for a historic triumph. The Romans are looking at a historical wound. Between the two sides lies a battlefield that is still marked by the blood and rain of the past few days. The forest is silent again, but its silence is now full of memory. And that's exactly what makes After the Blood Rain more than a subchapter. It is the chapter in which the event transitions into history. Death becomes meaning. Victory becomes expectation. Defeat turns into political shock. And a place in the Germanic forest becomes an echo that reaches far beyond its trees. Because some battles end when the guns fall silent. This one only really began to live on at that moment, in the minds of the victors and the vanquished. Chapter 15, Epilogue, an echo through the centuries. Some battles end on the field on which they were fought. Their dead are buried or forgotten. Their victors live on their fame for a while, and at some point the event sinks back into the ordinary movement of time. Other battles, however, do something different. They leave the place of their events. They wander into memories, into political decisions, into legends, into national dreams, and into the way in which later people want to understand themselves. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest is one of those few events whose actual story does not end with the last deaths, but only begins where memory, interpretation, and myth overlay reality. Therefore, this last chapter is not an addendum. It is the last and perhaps most important transformation of the material, the transformation of a historical event into an echo that takes on new meanings over the centuries. For the immediate present of the Romans, the defeat was a shock that had not only a military but also a psychological effect. The Reich, which had repeatedly experienced setbacks on its borders, was not fundamentally unaccustomed to defeats. But the destruction of 3 legions in a room that was already believed to be on the way to pacification shook something deeper. It wasn't just a losing battle. It was the refutation of an expectation. Germania had not proven to be the next malleable province, but a space in which Roman power could make a fool of itself at the moment of its self-assurance. And that's exactly why the news didn't just remain a report about fallen and lost standards. It became the trauma of the imperial consciousness. Augustus, who had led the empire into a new order after the civil wars, had to understand the loss not only as a military catastrophe, but also as an insult to the pax associated with his name. In later tradition, this is condensed in the image of an emperor who exclaims that Varus should return his legions to him. Whether the scene took place in the same way historically in every detail is almost secondary in the end. It is important that it is precisely this image that has been handed down. It shows how deeply the defeat had sunk into Rome's emotional memory. An emperor does not just mourn soldiers. He mourns order, reputation, predictability. The forest had taken away something from Rome that could not simply be dug up and armed, the feeling that its advance was inevitable. Of course, Rome did not react with permanent paralysis. An empire of its size could not and would not accept such a disgrace in silence. In the years after the catastrophe, new campaigns, punitive expeditions, retaliation, attempts to at least partially restore the lost honor followed. Germanicus later became the figure of this Roman answer, a general who once again showed military strength on the other side of the Rhine, visited battlefields, had fallen soldiers buried, and was supposed to give the Romans the feeling that the forest would not have the last word. And yet, even in these later undertakings, there was something different from what there was before the defeat. It was no longer just about expansion. It was about answering, about revenge, about symbolic recovery. The tone had changed. Where previously imperial self-evident had prevailed, there was now a trace of caution, perhaps also of recognition of the border. It is precisely here that the historical significance of the Teutoburg Forest becomes apparent. The defeat did not mean that Rome lost all influence in the Germanic areas or stopped acting militarily there, but it contributed to the fact that the Rhine strengthened itself more strongly as a permanent dividing line. The idea that Germania could easily be transformed into the same form of Roman provincialism as Gaul suffered a severe blow. Certainly, other factors were also decisive: costs, benefits, political priorities, logistics. History never depends on a single event alone. And yet the battle was a point where possibilities closed. Not definitively in every theoretical sense, but practically and symbolically with such force that the North entered history differently than many other regions that the empire had permanently absorbed. For the Germanic communities, on the other hand, the effect was not easy to measure in lasting unity. This is important because later legends often give the impression that Arminius' victory immediately marked the beginning of a closed, almost national future. It wasn't like that. The tribes remained different, rival, connected in changing alliances, or distant from each other. Germania did not become a united political body after the battle. This is precisely where historical sobriety lies. The victory did not create a nation in the modern sense. Rather, it created a tremendous moment of common action, a moment in which fragmentation could be overcome for a decisive goal. That's big enough. You don't have to stretch it into later ideas to recognize its meaning. And yet Arminius had an impact beyond this concrete military success. He became a figure on whom the idea that freedom was possible against a world empire was concentrated. For his contemporaries, this may have had direct political and military significance. But the more centuries passed, the more his figure detached itself from the narrow historical situation and became a symbol. This is precisely where the special power of historical figures lies. They live not only through what they have done, but through what later people want to see in them. Arminius thus gradually became more than a human being from a Cheruscan prince's son, a Roman-trained officer and politically highly complex border crosser. It became a projection surface. In antiquity itself, the memory of him initially remained embedded in the Roman perspective. For Roman historians, he was a dangerous opponent, a traitor, a cunning enemy, a man who won the victory through deception and knowledge of Roman weaknesses. This view is instructive because it contains both resistance and recognition. Those who only despise an opponent rarely ascribe such a lasting role to him. The Romans had to take Arminius seriously, precisely because he had hurt them so much. In their memory, he remained not just a barbaric leader, but an opponent of distinction, one who understood how Rome worked and became dangerous precisely for that reason. In the Middle Ages, on the other hand, the battle took a back seat to other narratives. The ancient world had not disappeared, but it was no longer the immediate interpretive framework of political life. Many ancient figures were remembered only in fragments, through manuscripts, chronicles, learned traditions. Arminius lived on, but not as an omnipresent figure of collective identity. It was only much later, when Europe began to take a new interest in antiquity and national narratives gained strength, that it was rediscovered with renewed intensity. This is exactly where the second career of the Teutoburg Forest begins, which is almost as revealing as the battle itself. In the early modern period, and especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, Arminius, often under the name Hermann, was transformed into a symbolic figure of German ideas of freedom. The historical complexity of his person often receded in favor of a clearer, more powerful image, the unifier of the Germanic tribes, the liberator from the foreign yoke, the first great hero of German history. This interpretation was not accidental. It corresponded to the needs of a time in which the question of national unity, cultural independence, and the relationship to foreign rule was posed with particular sharpness. Arminius was thus read less as a historical Cheruscan than as a forerunner of later German self-assertion. It is precisely this process that shows how history turns into myth. The myth takes a real event and detaches it from its original context in order to let it speak in a new present. This is not simply a lie, but it is no longer pure history either. It is a transformation. The forest, the legions, Varus, Arminius, all this now becomes a cultural image that points beyond antiquity. Monuments are created, poems, speeches, political interpretations. The Hermann monument in the 19th century is perhaps the most visible expression of this development. Here, the focus is no longer on the historically elusive border crosser, but on the heroic figure of the national liberator. An ancient battle becomes a modern symbol. But it is precisely such symbols that are never innocent. What a time makes of the past often says more about that time than about the past itself. In the 19th century, Hermann served the longing for unity and national pride. Later, he was sometimes drawn into more aggressive, ideologically charged interpretations. This is precisely why it is important to keep a clear view at the end of this story. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was undoubtedly historically momentous. But it was not the birth of a modern nation. It was an ancient border catastrophe with far-reaching effects, which was reinterpreted in very different ways by later centuries. Anyone who wants to understand it must see both the historical reality and the power of its later mythization. Perhaps this is precisely the real greatness of this material. It tells not only about a battle, but about how people make meaning out of a battle. First the survivors and those affected, then historians, then poets, politicians, monument builders, teachers, and entire societies. Each generation asks anew, what does this forest mean? What does Arminius mean? What does it mean that Rome failed here? Is it the story of freedom versus empire? The history of imperial hubris? The story of deception, terrain, and strategic genius? Or the story of how dangerous it is to forge simple identity from the past? All these questions are part of its echo, and that is precisely why it is worthwhile to return to the people in the epilogue. To Arminius, who was not a monument made of stone, but a man between two worlds, full of contradictions, politically clever, dangerous, and himself embedded in a time that knew no simple heroes. To Varus, who was more than a failed fool, namely an expression of Roman certainty in its vulnerable form. To Thusnelda, suggests, and the nameless warriors and legionnaires who paid for all this with their lives. The echo through the centuries must not completely swallow up the people from whom it emerged. Otherwise, only a symbol remains, but no more history. In the end, the Teutoburg Forest therefore remains a double place. On the one hand, it is a concrete historical event: rain, mud, tactics, betrayal, exhaustion, death. On the other hand, it is a space of memory in which later times have been reflected again and again. This is precisely where his enduring fascination lies. It is not a mere victory, not a mere defeat, not a mere myth. He is all of these things at the same time, layer upon layer. And perhaps that explains why his name has never completely fallen silent. Because it touches on something fundamental, the question of how powerful empires really are, how vulnerable their certainties can be, and how long a single historical moment can reverberate. So this story does not end with a final conclusion, but with an echo. Legions died in the forest. In Rome, an illusion died. In later centuries, both became memory, interpretation, myth. And even today, between the trees, there is that thought that has stood the test of time. That even the greatest empire in the world can fail in a place it has never really understood.